I should have known something was wrong when I saw my name card. While 200 guests filled the grand ballroom at my sister Rachel's wedding sipping champagne under crystal chandeliers, my seat was in the hallway on a folding chair next to the restrooms. Not a mistake. A message. You don't belong here. I sat there alone watching my own family celebrate through the doorway, pretending I didn't exist. My mother never once looked for me. Rachel laughed with her bridesmaids, radiant in her designer gown, while I fought back tears in my $50 dress under fluorescent lights. Then he appeared. A stranger in an expensive suit watching me with eyes that seemed to see everything. He sat down without asking, leaned close and whispered words that would change my life. Follow my lead. Pretend you're my date. Before I could respond, he took my hand and led me into that ballroom like I was royalty. When the best man finished his toast, this stranger, Ethan, took the microphone. The room fell silent. Rachel's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. "I'd like to talk about integrity," he began, his voice steady and cold. "About people who destroy others to build themselves up." Then he said my name, and my sister's perfect smile shattered like glass. What I didn't know was that this stranger held proof of a 15-year betrayal, one that had stolen my career, my inheritance, and my entire future. And tonight, he was going to expose it all. My name is Lauren Reed. I'm 38 years old, and for the past decade I've been working as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, the kind of quiet, invisible job that pays the bills, but doesn't inspire dinner party conversation. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Once I had a corner office at one of the city's most prestigious investment firms. Once I had a future. But that was before everything fell apart, before the scandal that destroyed my career and scattered the pieces of my life like ashes in the wind. Now I live alone in a studio apartment, keep my head down, and try not to think too much about the woman I used to be. Today, though, I couldn't avoid thinking about it. Today was my sister Rachel's wedding. I'd almost declined the invitation when it arrived 3 months ago, thick cream cardstock with gold-embossed lettering, the kind of stationery that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. But some stubborn part of me, the part that still remembered what it felt like to belong to a family, insisted I should go. Maybe this would be different. Maybe Rachel had changed. Maybe, just maybe, they'd finally see me as something other than the family disappointment. I should have known better. The Grandview Hotel was exactly the kind of venue Rachel would choose, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers, the type of place where even the air felt expensive. I'd worn my nicest dress, a simple navy number I'd bought on sale 2 years ago, and spent an hour on my hair and makeup. Walking through those massive oak doors, I'd felt a flicker of something dangerous hope. The lobby was already filling with guests when I arrived. Women glided past in designer gowns, their jewelry catching the light, their laughter bright and confident. Men in tailored suits checked their phones and adjusted their cufflinks. I recognized some faces from childhood distant cousins, family friends, people who used to know my name. A few glanced at me with vague recognition before looking away, their expressions sliding from curiosity to polite disinterest in the span of a heartbeat. I found the seating chart displayed on an elegant easel near the ballroom entrance. My heart hammered as I scanned the alphabetized list looking for my name among the table assignments. Table 1, immediate family. Table 2, the groom's parents and siblings. Table 3, Rachel's college friends. I kept reading my finger, trailing down the list past Table 10, Table 15, Table 20. My name wasn't there. For a moment, I thought there'd been a mistake. I checked again more carefully this time, my pulse loud in my ears. Still nothing. A woman in a hotel uniform approached, her smile professional and distant. "Can I help you find something? I'm looking for my table assignment. Lauren Reed. I'm the bride's sister." Her smile didn't waver, but something shifted in her eyes, pity maybe, or second-hand embarrassment. "Oh, yes. Just one moment." She pulled out a small notepad from her pocket and consulted it. "You're in the auxiliary seating area, just down that hallway to the left." Auxiliary seating area. The words hit me like a slap. I followed her directions, my heels clicking against the polished floor, each step taking me further from the warm glow of the ballroom. The hallway narrowed, the lighting shifting from the soft amber of chandeliers to the harsh fluorescent glare of utility spaces. I could smell the faint chemical tang of industrial cleaner. A door marked restrooms stood propped open, revealing gleaming white tile. And there, against the wall between the restrooms and a fire exit, sat a single folding chair. A cheap metal thing with a thin cushion, the kind you'd find in a church basement or community center. On the seat was a small place card with my name written in the same elegant calligraphy as the formal seating chart. Lauren Reed. I stared at it for a long moment, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of mistake, some bizarre mix-up that would be corrected any moment. But deep down in that place where truth lives even when we don't want to acknowledge it, I knew. This was deliberate. This was Rachel's doing. I sat down because I didn't know what else to do. The metal frame was cold even through my dress. From where I sat, I had a perfect view into the ballroom through the wide doorway, close enough to see everything too far away to be part of it. The room was breathtaking. Round tables draped in champagne-colored linens filled the space, each centerpiece a cascade of white roses and orchids. The head table sat on a raised platform decorated with fairy lights and trailing ivy. Guests were finding their seats now, greeting each other with hugs and air kisses, their voices creating a pleasant hum of anticipation. I saw my mother near the front, wearing a pale pink dress I'd never seen before, her silver hair swept up in an elegant twist. She was laughing at something my aunt said, her hand resting on the back of a chair at table 1. She looked beautiful and happy, completely at ease in this world of plenty. She didn't glance toward the hallway. Not once. A waiter in a crisp white jacket passed by, balancing a tray of champagne flutes and bacon-wrapped scallops. I watched him move through the ballroom, offering drinks and appetizers to the guests. He walked right past me without slowing down, as if the folding chair and the woman sitting on it were invisible. Even the staff could see I didn't belong here. I wanted to leave. Every cell in my body screamed at me to stand up, walk out those front doors and never look back. But my legs wouldn't move. I sat there frozen as memories I'd spent years trying to bury rose up like ghosts. I remembered my 8th birthday. Rachel had been 5, small and cute, with dark curls and big eyes that could melt anyone's heart. My parents had thrown her a party the week before, a princess theme with a bouncy castle and a magician and 30 of her little friends. For my birthday, my mother bought a sheet cake from the grocery store and sang to me at the kitchen table while my father worked late. When I'd asked why Rachel got a party, and I didn't, my mother had sighed and said, "You're older, Lauren. You understand that we can't do big celebrations every time. Rachel's still little." I remembered my college graduation. I'd worked so hard, finished in 3.5 years with honors, landed a job offer before I even walked across that stage. I'd sent my parents the ceremony details months in advance, highlighted the date on the calendar, reminded them a dozen times. The morning of graduation, my mother called to say they couldn't make it. Rachel had a dance recital, an important one, and she needed them there. "You understand, don't you, honey?" my mother had said. "You're so independent. Rachel needs more support." I'd walked across that stage and collected my diploma while my roommate's family cheered from the stands, pretending the empty seats beside them didn't matter. I remembered 1,000 small moments, each one a paper cut that didn't seem like much on its own, but together formed a pattern of neglect, so clear I couldn't understand how I'd ever missed it. Every milestone Rachel achieved was celebrated with fanfare and pride. Every accomplishment of mine was met with a nod and a, "That's nice, dear," before the conversation shifted back to Rachel. The hallway seat wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was the truth of my place in this family made physical. I'd always been on the outside looking in, and now everyone could see it. The band started playing inside the ballroom, a string quartet performing something classical and beautiful. Guests settled into their seats, their chatter quieting to an expectant hum. I heard the click of heels on marble, saw Rachel sweep into view at the ballroom entrance on my father's arm. She looked stunning. Her wedding dress was a masterpiece of lace and silk fitted perfectly to her slender frame, the train flowing behind her like water. Her dark hair was swept up in an intricate updo, her makeup flawless. She was everything a bride should be, radiant, confident, beautiful beyond words. She looked right past me as if I wasn't there. I felt something crack inside my chest, a fault line I'd been trying to hold together for years, finally giving way. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I blinked them back furiously. I wouldn't cry. Not here. Not where someone might see and report back to Rachel that I'd been weak, that I'd let her win. That's when I noticed him, a man in a dark suit, watching me from across the hallway, and something in his eyes told me he knew exactly why I was sitting there. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair touched with gray at the temples, and eyes that seemed to see straight through whatever polite masks people wore. His suit was custom-tailored, the kind that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent, charcoal gray, with subtle pinstripes that caught the light when he moved. But it wasn't the expensive clothes that made me notice him. It was the way he looked at me, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. He crossed the hallway with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from never having to prove yourself, his footsteps silent on the polished floor. When he reached my pathetic folding chair, he didn't hesitate or ask permission. He simply sat down on the floor beside me, his back against the wall, long legs stretched out in front of him, as if sitting in a hotel hallway during a wedding reception was the most natural thing in the world. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said, his voice low and smooth, with just a hint of something I couldn't quite place. Amusement, maybe, or sadness. I stared at him, too surprised to respond immediately. Up close, I could see he was probably late 30s, with fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. His expression was serious, thoughtful, as if he were working out a complicated equation in his head. "I'm sorry," I finally managed. "Do I know you?" "Not yet." He extended his hand. "Ethan Cole. I'm a friend of the groom." I shook his hand automatically, feeling the firm warmth of his grip. "Lauren." "I know." The words were simple, but something about the way he said them made my stomach tighten. "David mentioned you might be here." He continued, referring to Rachel's husband-to-be with an ease that suggested they were genuinely close. Though he didn't mention the creative seating arrangement. Heat flooded my cheeks. So even the groom's friends knew about my humiliation. Wonderful. I started to stand ready to finally leave this nightmare, but Ethan's next words stopped me cold. "Meridian Financial," he said quietly, and my blood turned to ice. That must have been devastating. I sank back onto the chair, my legs suddenly weak. Meridian Financial. The name I hadn't spoken aloud in years, the ghost that haunted every job application, every new introduction, every moment when I had to explain the 10-year gap in my resume where a thriving career should have been. "How do you—" My voice came out as a whisper. I cleared my throat and tried again. "How do you know about that?" He tilted his head, studying me with those unsettling, perceptive eyes. "I make it my business to know about financial irregularities, particularly ones that don't quite add up." "I don't understand what you mean." But my heart was hammering now, a wild, desperate rhythm that made it hard to breathe. "Don't you—" He shifted slightly, and something in his posture changed. He was still relaxed, still sitting casually on the floor, but now there was an intensity to him that hadn't been there before. A rising star analyst, brilliant track record, suddenly accused of embezzlement and doctored reports. Fired within 24 hours. Threatened with criminal prosecution if you fought back. And then, nothing. No charges filed, no investigation case closed. That doesn't strike you as odd. Every word he spoke was true, but hearing them from a stranger's mouth felt like being flayed open. I'd spent a decade trying to convince myself that maybe I had made some mistake, that maybe I'd deserved what happened, because the alternative that I'd been deliberately destroyed was too painful to accept. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, and I hated how small my voice sounded. "Because I think you were set up, and I think I know who did it." The hallway seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the folding chair, my knuckles white. "That's not possible. No one wouldn't they?" His eyes flicked toward the ballroom, toward the celebration where my family laughed and danced and toasted to Rachel's happiness. Some people destroy others because they enjoy the power. Some do it for profit. Some do it because they can't stand watching anyone else succeed. I followed his gaze and saw Rachel through the doorway, radiant in her wedding gown, holding court at the head table. My beautiful, charming, beloved little sister, the golden child who could do no wrong. "No," I said, but the word came out weak, unconvincing, even to my own ears. Ethan didn't argue. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, holding it between two fingers. "Cole Investments. I specialize in forensic financial analysis, finding patterns that others miss, uncovering fraud that's been carefully hidden." I took the card with trembling hands. The cardstock was heavy, expensive, with raised lettering that caught the light. An address in the financial district, a phone number, and email. "I'm not asking you to believe me right now," he said, standing up with fluid grace and brushing off his trousers. "But if you want answers, real answers about what happened to you, call me. I have information you need to see." "Why?" The question burst out of me. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." For the first time, something like emotion crossed his carefully neutral expression. "Because some people spend their whole lives in the shadows of those who don't deserve their light. And because someone should have stood up for you 10 years ago, but no one did." The statement was so specific, so perfectly aimed at the raw wound of my existence that I felt tears prick my eyes again. He'd taken the inchoate pain of my entire adult life and distilled it into a single sentence. "Think about it," he said, already turning toward the ballroom. "We'll talk after the wedding." I watched him walk away, this stranger who somehow knew my deepest shame, my darkest secrets. He moved through the doorway into the ballroom, but instead of joining the celebration, he stopped at the periphery. I saw him lean against one of the marble columns, his attention fixed on the head table where Rachel sat. The way he looked at her made something cold slither down my spine. It wasn't admiration or even curiosity. It was the way a chess player might study the board, calculating moves and counter-moves, looking for weaknesses and opportunities. Who was Ethan Cole? And what did he want? I looked down at his card, then back at the ballroom entrance where he'd disappeared into the shadows. My mind was reeling, trying to process everything he'd said, every impossible implication. And that's when I realized he'd said my name even though I'd never told him what it was. I sat in that hallway for another hour, Ethan's business card burning a hole in my clutch purse, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. The reception moved forward with clockwork precision. Dinner was served on china plates with gold rims. The cake was wheeled out, a towering confection of fondant and sugar flowers that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Through it all, I remained invisible in my folding chair, watching a celebration I'd never truly been invited to join. Then the best man stood up, tapping his fork against his champagne flute to get everyone's attention. He was young, maybe 25, with the easy confidence of someone who'd never experienced real hardship. His toast was exactly what you'd expect: jokes about David's bachelor days, sentimental remarks about finding true love, a wish for eternal happiness. The guests laughed and applauded at all the right moments. Rachel beamed up at her new husband, the picture of bridal bliss. When the best man finished, David rose from his seat at the head table. He kissed Rachel's cheek, took the microphone, and thanked everyone for coming. His voice was warm, his smile genuine. Then he said something that made my breath catch. "Before we continue, there's one more person I'd like to invite to say a few words. He's been a good friend to me during some difficult times, and his perspective has meant more than he probably knows. Ethan Cole, would you come up here?" The polite applause that followed David's invitation seemed to echo strangely in my ears. I watched Ethan stand from his position near that marble column, buttoning his suit jacket with casual precision. He moved through the ballroom like he owned it, weaving between tables with an easy grace that drew eyes. but my attention was fixed on Rachel. Her smile had frozen on her face, stretched tight like a mask that didn't quite fit anymore. Her hand, which had been resting on David's arm, now gripped it with enough force that I could see her knuckles turning white even from my distant vantage point. She was watching Ethan approach the microphone with the kind of intensity usually reserved for venomous snakes or approaching storms. Ethan took the microphone from David, shook his hand, and turned to face the assembled guests. The room settled into expectant silence, 200 people waiting for the obligatory pleasantries, the safe and predictable words that mark such occasions. "Thank you, David," Ethan began, his voice carrying easily through the sound system. "I appreciate the chance to speak today. Weddings are interesting events, aren't they? They're about celebrating love, yes, but they're also about family, about the bonds that shape us for better or worse." A few heads nodded. Rachel's smile had slipped slightly, revealing something raw and anxious underneath. "I've been thinking a lot lately about integrity." Ethan continued, his tone conversational, but his words carrying an edge that made people shift in their seats. "About the difference between who we appear to be and who we actually are. It's easy to look successful, to wear the right clothes, say the right things, surround yourself with beautiful objects and important people. But character, real character, shows up in how we treat those who can't do anything for us, how we behave when no one's watching, whether we build ourselves up by helping others rise or by pushing them down." The atmosphere in the room had changed. Guests were glancing at each other uncertainly, trying to figure out if this was still a toast or something else entirely. My mother had gone rigid in her seat, her champagne glass halfway to her lips. "I want to talk about someone I have tremendous respect for," Ethan said, and his eyes found mine across the ballroom, across the divide between the celebration and my exile. "Lauren Reed, the bride's sister." My name falling from his lips in front of 200 people felt like being struck by lightning. Suddenly faces were turning, necks craning, guests trying to locate me in the crowd. It took them a moment. I wasn't where family should be, wasn't at the prominent tables near the front. When they finally spotted me in the hallway, I saw confusion ripple through the room like a wave. "Lauren is quite possibly the most brilliant woman I've ever met," Ethan continued, his voice steady and clear. "7 years ago, my company was on the verge of bankruptcy. We'd made some catastrophic investment decisions, and I was about to lose everything I'd built. Lauren was working as a consultant for one of our subsidiary firms at the time. She spent 3 days analyzing our portfolio, identified the exact problems we'd missed, and created a restructuring plan that saved us. She didn't have to do it. It wasn't her job, wasn't her responsibility. But she saw people who needed help, and she helped them. That's who she is." The whispers started then, a confused murmur spreading through the ballroom. I saw guests leaning toward each other, exchanging puzzled comments. If I was so brilliant, their expressions seemed to ask, why was I sitting in the hallway? My mother had set down her glass, her face pale and pinched. She was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between horror and fury, as if I'd personally orchestrated this moment to embarrass her. But it was Rachel's reaction that held me transfixed. She had pushed back from the table slightly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the way the color had drained from her face. She was staring at Ethan with naked panic, her mouth slightly open, her breathing visible even from where I sat. David had placed a hand on her shoulder, leaning in to whisper something, but she didn't seem to hear him. "So I want to raise my glass," Ethan said, lifting his champagne flute, "to people who have integrity, even when it costs them, to those who help others, even when they won't get credit. And to Lauren, may you finally get the recognition you've always deserved." He drank his eyes, never leaving Rachel's face. The guests, uncertain but following social convention, raised their glasses and drank too. The applause that followed was confused, scattered people clapping because they didn't know what else to do. Then something extraordinary happened. An older couple from one of the middle tables stood up and walked toward the hallway. The man was distinguished-looking, silver-haired, while the woman wore a navy dress and pearls. They approached me with purpose, and suddenly I was standing, my legs shaking as they introduced themselves. Lauren Reed. I'm Thomas Whitmore. This is my wife, Patricia. You probably don't remember, but you consulted on our family trust 7 years ago. Your recommendations doubled our returns. Before I could respond, my mother was there, her hand gripping my elbow with painful force. "Excuse us," she said to the Whitmores, her smile brittle and false. "I need to speak with my daughter." She pulled me further down the hallway, away from the curious eyes, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. When we were alone, she whirled on me with fury blazing in her eyes. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed. "Making a spectacle of yourself, accepting attention like that. This is Rachel's day, Lauren, her day. Can't you just once let her have something without trying to steal the spotlight?" The accusation was so absurd, so utterly divorced from reality, that I almost laughed. But before I could form a response, I looked past my mother toward the ballroom entrance. Rachel was standing there, partially hidden by the doorframe, no longer surrounded by well-wishers and admirers. She was staring directly at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in my little sister's eyes. I drove home in a daze, my mother's angry words still ringing in my ears. Rachel's frightened expression burned into my memory. The city lights blurred past my windshield as I navigated streets I'd driven 1,000 times, my hands moving on autopilot, while my mind spiraled backward through time. Ethan's toast had done something I'd spent a decade trying to prevent. It had forced me to remember everything I'd worked so hard to forget. 10 years ago, I'd been someone completely different. I'd been Lauren Reed, senior financial analyst at Meridian Financial, with a corner office on the 42nd floor overlooking the harbor. My desk had been mahogany, my chair leather, and my computer displayed 3 monitors showing real-time market data from around the world. I'd earned every inch of that space through sheer determination and 70-hour work weeks that left me exhausted, but exhilarated. I was 28 years old and unstoppable. Meridian wasn't just any investment firm. It was the kind of place where senators kept their portfolios and Fortune 500 CEOs came for advice. Getting hired there straight out of business school had been a miracle. Surviving there required something beyond luck. It demanded brilliance, dedication, and a willingness to sacrifice everything else in your life. I'd given up weekends, holidays, any semblance of a social life. I'd skipped my college roommate's wedding because I had a presentation. I'd worked through the flu because showing weakness meant getting passed over for opportunities. My apartment had been a place to sleep 4 hours a night before returning to the office. But it had been worth it. My analyses were sought after by partners twice my age. I had a gift for seeing patterns in financial data that others missed, for understanding not just what the numbers said, but what they meant. When a manufacturing company's books looked too clean, I'd dig deeper and find the accounting tricks hiding declining sales. When a tech startup's projections seemed too optimistic, I'd spot the flawed assumptions that would doom them within a year. I'd saved clients millions by steering them away from bad investments and toward opportunities everyone else had overlooked. My bosses had noticed. 6 months before everything fell apart, the managing partner had called me into his office and told me I was on track for junior partner. At 28, I would have been one of the youngest in the firm's history. The promotion would have come with equity, with real power, with my name on the letterhead. I'd felt like I was flying. Then came the morning that destroyed everything. I'd arrived at the office at 6:30 earlier than usual because I had a presentation at 8. My keycard wouldn't work. I'd tried it 3 times before walking to the front desk, assuming it was a technical glitch. The security guard had looked at me with something like pity and told me to wait. 10 minutes later, 2 men in dark suits escorted me to a conference room I'd never been in before, windowless, sterile, designed for unpleasant conversations. They'd laid it out with brutal efficiency. Client funds were missing. Financial reports had been falsified to hide company losses. The digital trail led directly to me. They had emails with my signature authorizing questionable transfers. They had login records showing access from my computer at odd hours. They even had bank statements showing deposits to an offshore account that somehow bore my name, though I'd never opened any such account. I'd tried to explain that it was impossible, that I would never steal from clients, that someone must have framed me. But the evidence was overwhelming. The firm's attorneys made their position clear. If I went quietly, they wouldn't press criminal charges. If I fought back, they would prosecute me to the fullest extent of the law and make sure I never worked in finance again. They gave me 30 minutes to clean out my desk under supervision, taking only personal items. My computer, my files, my phone, everything stayed behind as evidence. Walking out of that building with a cardboard box and my career in ruins, I'd felt like I was drowning. I'd called my mother from the parking garage, my voice shaking desperately, needing someone to tell me it would be okay. She'd listened in silence as I explained what happened, how I'd been accused, how it was all a terrible mistake. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "Lauren, these kinds of things don't happen without reason. What did you actually do?" Those words had cut deeper than the accusations themselves. My own mother, without hesitation, had assumed I was guilty. When I'd insisted I was innocent, she'd sighed with the weary patience of someone dealing with a difficult child. "You've always been so ambitious. Maybe you took shortcuts. Maybe you got in over your head. Whatever it is, you need to take responsibility." I'd driven to my parents' house that evening, desperate to make them understand. My father had been in the late stages of kidney disease, by then spending most of his time in the recliner with an oxygen tank beside him. He'd looked so frail, so tired. When I'd tried to explain the situation, he'd simply closed his eyes and said he couldn't handle stress, that I needed to work things out on my own. Rachel had been there too, perched on the arm of the sofa, her expression sympathetic in a way that now made my skin crawl. She'd worked at Meridian for the past year as an administrative assistant, though we'd rarely crossed paths, different departments, different worlds. She'd hugged me and told me how sorry she was, how unfair it all seemed. I'd actually found comfort in that embrace, grateful for at least one person who seemed to believe in me. What I hadn't known, what I wouldn't discover until much later, was that Rachel had orchestrated the entire nightmare. She'd been dating someone in the IT department, a bitter man who felt passed over for promotions. Together, they'd gained access to systems they shouldn't have touched. Rachel had watched me enter my passwords enough times to figure them out. I'd been careless, trusting, never imagining my own sister would be studying my keystrokes. She'd forged my signature on documents, created false email trails, even set up that offshore account using information she'd stolen from our parents' files. Her motive was sickeningly simple. She couldn't stand watching me succeed. Every promotion I earned, every compliment I received, every moment I shined had been like acid on her skin. She'd spent our entire childhood being compared to me, hearing relatives praise my intelligence while dismissing her as merely pretty. In her twisted logic, destroying my career wasn't cruelty, it was evening the score. The months after my firing had been the darkest of my life. I'd applied to dozens of firms, but word had spread. No one wanted to hire someone accused of embezzlement, even without formal charges. I'd burned through my savings within 3 months. I'd moved from my nice apartment to a studio in a neighborhood where sirens wailed every night. I'd taken a job as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, work I could have done in my sleep for a fraction of my former salary. The poverty had been hard, but the isolation had been worse. Friends from Meridian stopped returning my calls, afraid of guilt by association. My family maintained their distance, my mother occasionally sending brief texts suggesting I get help or make better choices. I'd spent holidays alone, eaten dinner alone, gone to bed alone with nothing but the ceiling and my thoughts for company. I hadn't thought about those days in years. I'd buried them deep where they couldn't hurt me anymore. But Ethan's toast had ripped open every old wound, and suddenly I wanted answers more than I wanted peace. The email arrived on Monday morning, 3 days after the wedding. I'd spent the weekend in my apartment oscillating between replaying Ethan's toast in my mind and trying desperately to forget it had ever happened. My phone had buzzed twice with calls from my mother, both of which I'd ignored. Rachel hadn't contacted me at all, which somehow felt more ominous than if she had. The subject line was simple: "We should talk." The message itself was even briefer. "Lauren, I have information you need to see. Can you meet me at my office tomorrow at 10? The address is below. Ethan Cole. I stared at that email for 20 minutes, my cursor hovering over the delete button. Part of me wanted to pretend the wedding had never happened, that Ethan Cole didn't exist, that I could go back to my small, safe, predictable life. But another part of me, a part I'd thought had died years ago, was screaming that I couldn't let this go. Not now. Not when someone finally believed me. I showed up at his office at 9:45 the next morning, too anxious to be fashionably late. The building was one of those gleaming steel and glass towers in the financial district, the kind of place I used to work before my world collapsed. The lobby had marble floors and a waterfall feature security guards in crisp uniforms and elevator banks that required keycard access. I gave my name to the receptionist, feeling acutely aware of my department store suit and worn handbag, certain everyone could see I didn't belong here anymore. Ethan's office was on the 38th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The furniture was modern and expensive, all clean lines and leather upholstery. His assistant, a professional woman in her 50s, offered me coffee and led me to a conference room where Ethan was already waiting. He stood when I entered, gesturing to a chair across from him. Between us on the polished table sat a single manila folder. "Thank you for coming," he said, his tone businesslike but not cold. "I wasn't sure you would." I almost didn't. I sat down, gripping my purse in my lap like a shield. "What is this about Mr. Cole? Why did you say those things at the wedding? How do you know about Meridian?" He opened the folder and pulled out several documents, sliding them across the table toward me. "I've been investigating your sister for 6 months. What I've found suggests a pattern of behavior that goes back years. You weren't her first victim, Lauren, and unless someone stops her, you won't be her last." The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked down at the papers in front of me, bank statements, email printouts, corporate records. My hands were shaking as I picked up the first page. "Rachel worked at Meridian when you were fired," Ethan continued. "She had administrative access to several systems. She was also dating an IT specialist named Marcus Chen, who was later fired for security violations. I've tracked down 3 other people whose careers were damaged in ways that benefited Rachel. A colleague who was up for the same promotion she wanted. A friend whose boyfriend Rachel stole. In each case, there's a pattern access opportunity, and Rachel emerging unscathed while someone else's life falls apart." I wanted to argue to defend my sister, but the evidence in front of me was damning. More than that, it fit. It explained the inexplicable, gave shape to suspicions I'd never fully allowed myself to acknowledge. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you get out of exposing her?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw real emotion cross his carefully controlled features. "Because no one stood up for you then, and someone should now. Because people like Rachel keep getting away with destroying others until someone forces them to face consequences. And because," he paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully, "because she did something similar to me years ago, I know what it's like to be betrayed by someone you trusted." The admission hung in the air between us. I wanted to ask for details, but something in his expression told me that conversation would come later, if at all. "What are you proposing?" I asked instead. "I want to build a comprehensive case documenting Rachel's fraudulent activities. I want to expose what she did to you, to me, to others. Not just for revenge, but to prevent her from doing this again. To make sure the next person she targets has a fighting chance." He pulled another document from the folder. "But I need your help. You know her better than anyone. You know how she operates." I looked at the paper he'd placed in front of me. It was an internal memo from Meridian Financial dated 10 years ago. My hands trembled as I read the header, "System Access Authorization Request." Below it, in neat administrative text, was a request for Rachel Reed to be granted temporary access to Lauren Reed's email account for administrative support purposes. At the bottom was a signature I recognized Rachel's looping handwriting, official and damning. "This is how she did it," I breathed. She had my passwords. She could read my emails, send messages as me plant evidence. Yes, and this memo was buried in archived files that should have been destroyed years ago. Someone kept it, probably sensing something wasn't right. I found it through a private investigator who specializes in corporate fraud. I stared at that signature, my sister's name in ink that had been dry for a decade. All these years I'd wondered if maybe I'd made mistakes, if perhaps I'd been careless in ways I couldn't remember. I'd internalized the blame because I'd had no proof of my innocence. Now, holding evidence of Rachel's guilt, I felt something crack open inside me, not just anger, but a terrifying sense of possibility. If I do this, I said slowly, my family will never forgive me. My mother will say I'm destroying Rachel's life out of jealousy. I'll lose whatever scraps of relationship we still have. Is that relationship worth protecting? Ethan asked quietly. Has your silence earned you their love? Or has it just taught them that you'll accept anything they do to you? The truth of his words cut deep. I'd spent 10 years being quiet, being accommodating, hoping that if I just didn't make waves, my family would eventually see my worth. Instead, they'd seated me in a hallway at my sister's wedding. I thought about Rachel's face when Ethan had mentioned my name during his toast, the panic, the fear. For once, she'd been the one who felt exposed, vulnerable, afraid. For once, I hadn't been the victim. Okay, I said, and the word felt like jumping off a cliff. I'll help you. Tell me what you need. Ethan's expression shifted, something like relief or perhaps respect flickering in his eyes. He pulled out a contract, a formal agreement outlining our arrangement. As I read through it, I realized I was agreeing to more than just helping with an investigation. I was agreeing to reclaim my story, to stop being the person things happened to, and become the person who made things happen. I signed my name at the bottom, my handwriting steadier than I expected. As I walked out of Ethan's office with a copy of that memo in my bag, I realized I wasn't the same woman who'd sat in that hallway chair. I was done being invisible. The following week, I started working from Ethan's office 3 days a week. He'd set me up in a small conference room with a window view, a new laptop, and access to financial databases I hadn't touched in a decade. The first morning, his assistant brought me coffee without asking how I took it. She'd somehow already known I preferred it black with 1 sugar. When I walked through the office, people nodded and smiled, treating me like I belonged there. No one whispered behind their hands or looked at me with barely concealed pity. They simply accepted my presence as normal, natural, deserved. Ethan had assembled a small team to help with the investigation, a forensic accountant named Margaret, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the sharp eyes of someone who missed nothing, and a young attorney named James, who specialized in corporate fraud cases. In our first meeting, Ethan introduced me as one of the best financial analysts in the business, and neither Margaret nor James questioned it. They simply opened their files and started asking for my opinion on transaction patterns, shell company structures, and suspicious fund transfers. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have my expertise valued. When I pointed out that certain payments to a consulting firm looked like disguised personal expenses, Margaret nodded approvingly and added it to her notes. When I suggested we cross-reference Rachel's travel dates with unusual wire transfers, James immediately pulled up the relevant records. They listened when I spoke. They took my observations seriously. They treated me like a professional, not a cautionary tale. The work itself was intoxicating. Ethan had given me access to financial software that cost thousands of dollars per month, programs that could track money across multiple accounts, identify patterns in transaction timing, flag anomalies that human eyes might miss. I spent hours staring at spreadsheets following the digital trails of Rachel's financial activities. Each discovery felt like fitting together pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for years. Rachel had been busy. Over the past decade, she'd moved money through a network of accounts and shell companies with impressive sophistication. There were payments to contractors who didn't seem to exist, consulting fees for services, never rendered expense reimbursements for trips that appeared purely personal. Nothing was blatantly illegal on its own, but the pattern was clear to anyone who knew how to look. Rachel was siphoning money systematically carefully, in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic audits. I found myself staying late at the office long after Margaret and James had gone home. The building would grow quiet, just the hum of computers and the distant sound of cleaning crews on other floors. I'd order takeout and eat at my desk, barely tasting the food, my attention fixed on the screens in front of me. Partly, I stayed because the work was genuinely engrossing, but mostly I stayed because the alternative was going back to my studio apartment, back to the small life I'd built from the ruins of my old one. Here in this conference room, with its view of the city lights, I could pretend I was who I used to be. I could remember what it felt like to matter. But as the days passed, small inconsistencies began to trouble me. I'd been working through Ethan's files on Rachel, adding my own findings to his existing research, when I noticed something odd. The oldest documents in his collection were dated 15 years ago. Photographs of Rachel at various social events, printouts of social media posts from her college years, even a copy of her undergraduate transcript. This wasn't the work of 6 months as he'd claimed at our first meeting. This was years of systematic surveillance. One afternoon, while Ethan was in a meeting with potential investors, I started digging deeper into his files. There were photographs I'd glimpsed before but hadn't examined closely. Rachel at a charity gala, Rachel at a beach resort, Rachel having dinner at restaurants I recognized as expensive and exclusive. In several photos, she was with different men, always dressed beautifully, always smiling that radiant smile that had charmed everyone our whole lives. When I asked Ethan about the scope of his research, he'd been evasive. "I'm thorough," he'd said with a slight shrug. "When I investigate someone, I want the complete picture." But thoroughness didn't explain why he had photographs from Rachel's college graduation or why he'd tracked down her roommates from a decade ago for interviews. This wasn't professional diligence. This was obsession. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that Ethan had explained his motivations clearly, that I had no reason to doubt him. But doubt had planted itself in my mind like a seed, and I couldn't stop it from growing. The email arrived on a Thursday evening. I was alone in the conference room, working through another set of transaction records, when my personal email pinged with a new message. The sender was a string of random letters and numbers, clearly a burner account. The subject line made my blood run cold. "He's not who you think." I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam or some kind of phishing attempt. But something made me click it open. There was no message in the body, just a single attachment. My hand trembled slightly as I downloaded the image file. The photograph was professional quality, taken at what looked like an upscale Italian restaurant. The lighting was warm, intimate, the kind of place you took someone when you wanted to impress them. Ethan sat across a small table from Rachel, both of them dressed formally, clearly on some kind of date, but it was the details that made my stomach drop. Ethan's hand was covering Rachel's on the white tablecloth, his fingers intertwined with hers, in a gesture of unmistakable intimacy. Rachel was looking at the camera. Someone must have taken the photo for them, with a smile I recognized from 1,000 family gatherings. It was her victory smile, the expression she wore when she'd gotten exactly what she wanted. She was leaning slightly toward Ethan, her free hand touching the side of his face with casual possessiveness. The photograph was time-stamped in the corner 5 years ago. 3 years after my firing from Meridian. 2 years before Rachel had met David, the man she'd just married. I stared at that photograph for an hour, trying to find an innocent explanation, but the way Rachel smiled at the camera, radiant, triumphant, possessive, told me everything I needed to know. Ethan hadn't just known my sister. He'd been in love with her. I printed the photograph that night and barely slept. By 6 a.m, I was showered, dressed, and sitting in the parking garage of Ethan's building, waiting for the security guard to unlock the main doors. I rode the elevator to the 38th floor alone, my reflection in the polished metal walls showing a woman who looked calm and composed, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. Ethan's office door was still locked when I arrived, but his assistant Jennifer came in 20 minutes later, startled to find me sitting on the bench outside. "Lauren, I didn't expect anyone this early. Is everything all right?" "I need to speak with Ethan as soon as he arrives." She must have heard something in my voice because she nodded without asking questions and unlocked the office suite. I went straight to the conference room where I'd been working, gathered the files I'd been analyzing, and carried everything to Ethan's private office. Then I sat in one of his visitor chairs and waited. He arrived at 7:30 carrying his usual coffee and leather briefcase, his suit jacket slung over one arm. He stopped in the doorway when he saw me, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness in the span of a heartbeat. "We need to talk," I said, and slid the photograph across his desk. Ethan set down his coffee with careful precision, hung his jacket on the back of his chair, and picked up the photograph. He studied it for a long moment, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. When he finally looked up at me, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Vulnerability, maybe, or exhaustion. The mask of confident control he always wore had cracked just enough to show the man underneath. "Where did you get this?" His voice was steady but quiet. "Someone emailed it to me, an anonymous account, last night." I leaned forward, keeping my own voice level despite the anger and betrayal churning in my stomach. "You told me you'd been investigating Rachel for 6 months. You said she'd done something similar to you, but you didn't say you'd been engaged to her. You didn't mention that you'd been in love with my sister." Ethan set the photograph down and rubbed his face with both hands, suddenly looking older than his 37 years. When he dropped his hands, he met my eyes directly. "You're right. I should have told you from the beginning. I was afraid if you knew the full story, you wouldn't agree to help me. So tell me now, the full story. No more evasions." He nodded slowly, then stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city as he spoke. "I met Rachel 5 years ago at a children's hospital charity gala. She was volunteering for the event wearing this simple blue dress, and she seemed different from everyone else there. Genuine, kind. When I introduced myself, she told me she worked in nonprofit development, that she'd grown up in a family that didn't value compassion, and she was trying to make a difference in her own way." His voice carried a bitterness that hadn't been there before. "It was all lies, of course, but I didn't know that. I fell for her completely. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she seemed to understand me. She'd ask about my work, seem fascinated by the details of investments and markets that usually made people's eyes glaze over. She'd bring me dinner when I was working late. She'd remember small things I'd mentioned in passing. She made me feel seen." I stayed silent, letting him continue watching the tension in his shoulders as he relived what was clearly still painful. We were together for 8 months before I proposed. She said yes, immediately started planning this elaborate wedding. Around that same time, she began spending more time at my house, said she wanted to feel like it was our home. She'd reorganize my office, make it more efficient, she said. Help me file documents. I thought she was being supportive. I didn't realize she was photographing confidential files and forwarding them to someone else. He turned back to face me, and I saw real pain in his eyes now. Marcus Chen, one of my competitors, launched a hostile takeover bid 3 months after our engagement. He knew things about my company that should have been impossible to know. Which clients were unhappy, which investments were underperforming, which board members might be swayed to his side. The attack was surgical, targeted, devastating. How did you figure out it was Rachel? I hired a forensic IT specialist to trace the leak. He found that documents had been accessed from my home computer during hours when I wasn't there, but Rachel was. He found emails from her personal account to an address that eventually traced back to Marcus. When I confronted her, I expected denials, tears, apologies. Instead, she laughed. The word hung in the air like something poisonous. I knew that laugh, had heard it directed at me countless times growing up when Rachel had gotten away with something particularly cruel. She told me I'd been too easy. Ethan continued, his voice tight with remembered humiliation. That Marcus had offered her $200,000 plus a percentage of the company if the takeover succeeded. She said I was sweet but not particularly interesting, and she'd gotten bored months ago. Then she took off her engagement ring, left it on my kitchen counter, and walked out. I felt sick. Not because I doubted his story, every detail rang true with the Rachel I knew, but because I was starting to understand the depth of what we were dealing with. What happened with the takeover? I managed to fight it off, but it cost me millions and nearly destroyed my reputation. It took 3 years to fully recover. During that time, I started investigating Rachel, trying to understand how someone could be that calculating, that cruel. That's when I found the others. Others. At least 4 people whose lives Rachel had damaged in similar ways. A former roommate whose boyfriend Rachel stole, then dumped after draining his bank account. A colleague who lost a promotion after Rachel spread false rumors about her. A business partner whose company Rachel helped sabotage to clear competition for a friend. And you fired from Meridian based on evidence that was too perfect, too convenient. He walked back to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a thick folder. I've been documenting everything, building a case that shows this isn't bad luck or isolated incidents. It's a pattern. Rachel is a predator, Lauren. She identifies successful people, gets close to them, and destroys them for profit or entertainment, sometimes both. I stared at the folder, my mind racing. Everything he was saying aligned with what I'd discovered, with what I'd always suspected, but never had the courage to voice. But I also couldn't ignore the fact that I was sitting in the office of a man whose motivations were tangled with heartbreak and humiliation. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked quietly. "Why let me think this was just about justice?" "Because I wasn't sure you'd help me if you knew I'd been romantically involved with her. I thought you might see me as just another bitter ex-boyfriend seeking revenge. And maybe you'd be right." He sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "But that doesn't make what Rachel did to you any less real. It doesn't make the evidence any less valid. It doesn't mean she shouldn't face consequences." I wanted to walk out. Part of me was screaming that I'd been manipulated again, that I'd let myself be used as a weapon in someone else's vendetta. But another part of me, the part that had been analyzing Rachel's financial crimes for the past week, the part that had seen the clear pattern of deliberate destruction, knew that Ethan was right about one thing. Rachel wouldn't stop on her own. She'd keep finding victims, keep destroying lives, keep getting away with it because she was beautiful and charming, and no one wanted to believe that someone who looked like her could be so thoroughly rotten inside. When Ethan finished his story, I asked him the only question that mattered. "Am I helping you stop a predator, or am I just your weapon against the woman who broke your heart?" His answer, maybe both, was more honest than I'd expected, and far more dangerous than I'd wanted to hear. I spent the rest of that morning sitting in Ethan's office, trying to decide whether to continue working with him or walk away from the entire situation. His honesty about his motivations had been disarming, but it had also complicated everything. Could I trust a man whose judgment had been clouded by romantic betrayal? Was I being used, or were we genuinely working toward the same goal? The decision was made for me 2 days later when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't seen in years, but still recognized instantly. Rachel. "Lauren, can we talk? I think there's been a misunderstanding. Coffee tomorrow." I stared at those words, my pulse quickening. Rachel never reached out to me. In the years since my firing from Meridian, our communication had been limited to obligatory holiday texts and the occasional family gathering where we maintained a cold civility. For her to initiate contact now after Ethan's toast at the wedding meant she was worried. I showed Ethan the text that afternoon. He read it twice, then looked up at me with an expression I was learning to recognize, the calculating look of someone playing chess several moves ahead. "She's scared," he said simply. "She knows I said your name at the wedding. She knows you're connected to me somehow. She's reaching out to control the narrative before you hear my version of events." "Should I meet her?" "Absolutely. But we need to prepare you first." We spent the next several hours in what Ethan called strategic coaching. He explained Rachel's likely tactics, the psychological manipulation techniques she favored, the ways she would try to make me doubt my own perceptions. He taught me how to appear receptive while actually gathering information, how to ask questions that seemed innocent but would force Rachel to reveal more than she intended. Most importantly, he taught me how to recognize when she was lying, The tiny tells she probably didn't even know she had. The next afternoon, I met Rachel at a cafe in the Arts District, the kind of trendy place with exposed brick walls and artisanal pastries that cost $8 each. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cappuccinos waiting. She stood when she saw me, and I was struck again by how effortlessly beautiful she was. Her cashmere sweater was the color of cream, her jeans designer denim that fit perfectly, her hair falling in glossy waves over her shoulders. She looked like someone who'd never had a difficult day in her life. "Lauren." She hugged me, and I caught the scent of her perfume, something expensive and floral. "Thank you so much for coming. I wasn't sure you would." I sat down across from her, wrapping my hands around the warm coffee cup. "Your text said there was a misunderstanding. What did you mean?" Rachel's expression shifted into what I now recognized as her concerned sister face, eyebrows slightly drawn, lips pressed together in worry, head tilted just enough to convey empathy. "I've been hearing things about you spending time with Ethan Cole, and I'm worried about you, Lauren. I really am." "Worried about what?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice as if sharing a confidence. "Ethan is not a stable person. I know him, and I need to tell you the truth about what happened between us." She paused, and I saw her eyes begin to shimmer with tears that seemed to appear on command. "We dated years ago. It was brief, and when I ended things, he didn't take it well. He became obsessed, Lauren. He followed me. He showed up at my apartment at odd hours. I had to get a restraining order." I kept my face neutral, though my heart was racing. This was exactly what Ethan had predicted, Rachel recasting herself as the victim, painting him as the dangerous one. That sounds frightening. It was. She reached across the table and took my hand, her skin soft and warm. "And now I'm terrified that he's using you to get back at me. That he's filling your head with lies about me, manipulating you because he knows you're my sister. Please, Lauren, you have to see what he's doing. He's dangerous." I let her hold my hand, let her think her touch was reassuring me. "What kind of lies would he tell?" "I don't know exactly, but he's convinced himself that I somehow wronged him, that I destroyed his business or stole from him, or I don't even know what stories he's created. The man needs help, professional help. And I'm so afraid he's going to hurt you to hurt me." I watched her perform, saw every calculated gesture, every rehearsed expression. What struck me most was how good she was at this. If I hadn't spent the last week learning to recognize manipulation, if Ethan hadn't prepared me for exactly this conversation, I might have believed her. The tears looked real. The concern seemed genuine. Even the slight tremor in her voice when she mentioned the restraining order was perfectly executed. "Rachel," I said carefully, "did you set me up at Meridian 10 years ago?" For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. Then her expression smoothed into confusion. "What, Lauren? No. Why would you even ask that?" "I'm asking directly. Did you have anything to do with me losing my job?" "Of course not." She squeezed my hand, her voice taking on a hurt tone. "I can't believe you'd think that. You're my sister. I love you. Yes, we've had our differences, and I know Mom and Dad paid more attention to me growing up, but I would never deliberately hurt you. That job situation was a tragedy, but it wasn't my fault. Sometimes, bad things just happen." There it was, the deflection Ethan had warned me about. She hadn't denied it. Not really. She'd expressed hurt at the question, reframed the conversation around my supposed accusation being hurtful to her, and then minimized what had happened to me as just bad things. She was making me feel guilty for even asking. "Maybe you're right," I said, letting doubt creep into my voice. "Maybe I'm being paranoid." Relief washed over Rachel's features. "It's understandable. Ethan is very convincing. That's what makes him so dangerous. He knows how to get inside people's heads." She pulled her hand back and picked up her cappuccino, taking a delicate sip. "I just want you to be careful, Lauren. Family is everything. Mom is already so upset about the tension between us. She called me crying after the wedding, saying she doesn't understand why there's all this drama suddenly. We can't let some outsider destroy our family. I noticed she'd pivoted to our mother, using guilt and family obligation as weapons. Every word was chosen carefully, designed to make me question my alliance with Ethan and feel responsible for family discord that I hadn't created. We talked for another 20 minutes, Rachel weaving her narrative with impressive skill. She asked about my life with what seemed like genuine interest, told me how beautiful I'd looked at the wedding, even suggested we should spend more time together now that she was married and settling into a new phase of life. By the time we stood to leave, she seemed satisfied that her performance had worked. As I left the cafe, Rachel hugged me goodbye and whispered, "I'm glad you're finally seeing clearly." And I realized with a chill that she thought she'd won, which meant she had no idea what was actually coming. I reported back to Ethan after my meeting with Rachel, and we agreed I should maintain the pretense of being swayed by her performance. Over the next week, I sent her occasional texts. Nothing committal, just enough to make her believe she was successfully pulling me back under her influence. She responded with enthusiasm, sending me links to articles she thought I'd enjoy, suggesting lunch dates. I politely postponed acting like the loving sister she'd never actually been. Then the package arrived. It was waiting outside my apartment door when I got home from work on a Tuesday evening. A small box wrapped in expensive paper with Rachel's name and return address printed on the label. For a moment, I considered not opening it, just throwing the entire thing in the trash. But curiosity won out. I carried it inside, set it on my kitchen counter, and carefully peeled away the wrapping. Inside was a velvet jewelry box, the kind that held something significant. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the lid, and when I saw what was inside, the air went out of my lungs. The necklace was exquisite Art Deco design platinum chain with a pendant featuring a central diamond surrounded by smaller sapphires arranged in a geometric pattern. Even in the dim light of my kitchen, it caught and refracted light in a way that spoke of exceptional quality and significant value. But it wasn't the beauty of the piece that made my heart hammer against my ribs. It was recognition. This was my grandmother's necklace. The one that had disappeared 15 years ago after her funeral, the one my father had promised would come to me because I was the eldest granddaughter. I remembered him showing it to me when I was 16, telling me about how his mother had received it from her own mother, how it had been in our family for 3 generations. He'd said it should go to someone who would appreciate its history, its significance. He'd said it should be mine. After grandmother died, the necklace had vanished. We'd searched through her belongings, checked the safe deposit box, asked the funeral home if perhaps it had been removed before the viewing. My mother had insisted it must have been lost somehow, that grandmother had probably sold it years ago during a financial difficulty none of us had known about. Eventually, we'd stopped looking. I'd mourned its loss along with my grandmother, another connection to family history severed. Now here it was delivered to my door like it had never been missing at all. There was a note tucked into the box, written in Rachel's flowing handwriting on cream-colored cardstock. "I found this while cleaning out some old storage boxes. It belongs in the family. Maybe you can wear it to my next party. I'm hosting a dinner in 3 weeks. Would love to see you there. XO, Rachel." I read the note 3 times each reading, making my hands shake harder. The casual tone, the cheerful suggestion, the kiss and hug at the end, all of it was designed to look like sisterly generosity. But I understood what this really was. Rachel was telling me she'd had the necklace all along. She'd taken something meant for me and kept it for 15 years, probably wearing it to events, showing it off, enjoying both the beauty of the piece and the secret knowledge that she'd stolen it from me. The suggestion that I wear it to her party was the cruelest part. She wanted to see me display the stolen necklace, wanted to watch me smile and thank her while wearing evidence of her theft. She was testing me, seeing if I'd been sufficiently manipulated during our coffee meeting, checking whether I would play the role of grateful younger sister who was just happy to be included. I couldn't stay in my apartment. I grabbed my keys, put the necklace back in its box, and drove straight to Ethan's office. It was after 7, but I knew he'd still be there. He'd mentioned he was working on a presentation for potential investors. I called him from the parking garage and he came down to meet me, taking one look at my face and guiding me to his office without asking questions. "She sent me this," I said, handing him the box. My voice was shaking, and I hated how weak I sounded. "It's my grandmother's necklace, the one that went missing 15 years ago. Rachel's had it this entire time." Ethan opened the box and studied the necklace with the careful attention he gave to important documents. He lifted it from its velvet cushion, letting the chain pool in his palm, while he examined the pendant under his desk lamp. "It's beautiful, and clearly valuable. Art Deco, probably 1920s, based on the style. My father promised it to me when I was 16. After grandmother died, it disappeared. We all thought it was lost." I sank into one of his visitor chairs, feeling exhausted suddenly. "She's had it all this time, Ethan. She stole it and kept it, and now she's giving it back like it's some generous gift, like she's doing me a favor." "May I?" He was already turning the pendant over, examining it from different angles. His fingers found something I'd missed, a tiny clasp on the back, so subtle it was almost invisible. "Lauren, look at this." I stood and leaned over his desk as he carefully pressed the clasp. The back of the pendant opened like a locket, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside was a piece of paper folded into a tiny square yellowed with age. Ethan unfolded it with careful fingers, spreading it flat on his desk under the lamp. The handwriting was spidery and old-fashioned, written in fountain pen ink that had faded to brown. But it was still perfectly legible. "My dearest Lauren," it began, and I recognized my grandmother's handwriting immediately. "If you are reading this, then you have received the necklace as I intended. I leave it to you along with my other wishes for the family. The business shares the investments, the real estate holdings. These should go to you, my eldest granddaughter, because you have the mind and the heart for it. Rachel is beautiful and charming, but she lacks your integrity. I have seen in her a tendency toward cruelty that worries me. Trust yourself, Lauren. You are the future of this family. The full will is with my attorneys Morrison and Associates. Make sure they honor my wishes. With all my love, Grandmother Elizabeth." I had to sit down. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. My grandmother had believed in me. She'd seen me clearly, seen Rachel clearly, and made provisions to protect the family legacy. And Rachel had stolen this letter, hidden it away, made sure I never knew. "Morrison and Associates," Ethan said quietly, already reaching for his phone. "That's the law firm. We can track them down, find out if the will still exists." I couldn't speak. I could only stare at my grandmother's words, written in a hand that had been dead for 15 years, telling me what I'd never let myself fully believe, that I wasn't the problem, that I had never been the problem, that someone had seen my worth and tried to protect me. As I read my grandmother's words, "Lauren is the future of this family," I felt something crack open inside me, and I realized that Rachel hadn't just stolen my career and reputation. She'd stolen the life I was supposed to have, and she'd been wearing the evidence around her neck at dinner parties for 15 years. Ethan made the call to his private investigator that same night, reading my grandmother's letter aloud over the phone, while I sat in his office still numb from the discovery. The investigator, a former FBI agent named Marcus Webb, promised to have information within 48 hours. He delivered in 36. Morrison and Associates had merged with a larger firm called Brennan Legal Group in 2018, and most of the old files had been digitized and archived. But Gerald Morrison himself, the founding partner, was still alive, 82 years old, and living in a modest ranch house in the suburbs about 40 minutes from the city. Marcus had already made contact, explaining that a former client's granddaughter needed to speak with him about an estate matter. Morrison had agreed to meet with us the following afternoon. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about my grandmother, trying to remember details about her that I'd let fade over the years. She'd been a formidable woman, sharp-minded even in her 80s, with steel-gray hair she wore in a neat bun and eyes that seemed to see through whatever front people presented. She'd built the family real estate business from almost nothing after my grandfather died young, turning a handful of rental properties into a portfolio that spanned 3 counties. I remembered Sunday dinners at her house, how she'd ask me about school, about my plans, about what I was reading. She'd actually listened to my answers, unlike my parents, who always seemed distracted or eager to redirect attention to Rachel. The next afternoon, Ethan and I drove to Morrison's address, a tidy house with a well-maintained lawn and flower beds that suggested someone who still took pride in appearances despite their age. Gerald Morrison answered the door himself, a tall man, slightly stooped now with wispy white hair and glasses that magnified his pale blue eyes. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "You have Elizabeth's eyes," he said finally. "And her chin. You must be Lauren." "Yes, sir. Thank you for agreeing to see us." He ushered us into a living room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. The furniture was comfortable but dated, and the walls were lined with photographs. Morrison, with various clients over the years, Morrison receiving awards from the State Bar Association. Morrison, with what I assumed was his late wife. He offered us tea, which we both declined, then settled into an armchair with a sigh that spoke of aching joints and a long life. "I've been expecting someone to come asking about Elizabeth Reed's estate for years," he said without preamble. When Marcus called, my first thought was, finally. Ethan leaned forward. "You remember the case specifically?" "Of course I do. Elizabeth was meticulous about her estate planning. She came to see me 6 months before she died, said she wanted to make absolutely certain her wishes were clear and legally airtight. She was worried about her family, particularly about one of her granddaughters." He looked directly at me. "She loved you very much. She was afraid you'd be taken advantage of." My throat tightened. "What happened to the will she created with you?" Morrison stood with some effort and walked to a large oak cabinet in the corner of the room. He opened it and pulled out a locked file box, producing a small key from his pocket. "When I retired, most of my files went to the successor firm as required by law. But there were a few cases that troubled me, cases where I sensed something wasn't right. I kept personal copies of those files properly secured just in case." He pulled out a folder and returned to his chair. "Your grandmother's estate was one of them." He opened the folder and began laying documents on the coffee table between us. I recognized the legal language of a last will and testament, the formal structure of asset distribution, the signatures and witness statements that made it official. 3 weeks after Elizabeth died, a young woman came to my office claiming to be the sole heir. She had a copy of what she said was Elizabeth's will, but it looked wrong to me. The signatures didn't quite match, and more importantly, the asset distribution was completely different from what Elizabeth and I had discussed. The original will left 80% of the business shares to Lauren Reed, 15% to Rachel Reed, and 5% to Margaret Reed. The document this young woman showed me split everything equally between the two granddaughters, with nothing for the mother. "Let me guess," Ethan said quietly. "The young woman was Rachel." Morrison nodded. "She was charming, confident, seemed genuinely bereaved. But I've been practicing law for over 50 years. You develop an instinct for when someone is lying. I told her I needed to verify the document against my files before proceeding with probate. She became agitated, said there was no need for delays, that her grandmother had told her this was the will. When I insisted, she left, and I never heard from her again. I assumed she'd hired a different attorney to handle the estate. Which is exactly what she did," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "She used a different law firm and presented that forged will to them. They processed it without ever contacting you to verify." "I should have done more," Morrison said, and I heard genuine regret in his voice. "I should have tracked down the family, made sure the real will was executed. But I was dealing with my wife's cancer diagnosis at the time, and I told myself it wasn't my responsibility if the family chose to use different counsel. I've regretted that decision for 15 years. He pulled out another document from the folder, a certified copy of the original will complete with official seals and notarization. "This is yours. I had 3 copies made when Elizabeth signed the original, all properly certified. She was that concerned about protecting her wishes." I took the document with trembling hands and began to read. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was crystal clear. My grandmother had left me controlling interest in Reed Properties and Investments, a company that, according to the asset valuation, had been worth $3 million at the time of her death. There were also specific bequests: her jewelry to me, her personal papers to me, even her recipe box to me. Everything that mattered, everything that carried memory and meaning, she'd wanted me to have. Attached to the will was a letter written in her handwriting on her personal stationery. It was addressed to me, and reading it felt like having her in the room with me again. "My dearest Lauren," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, but I hope not forgotten. I want you to know that I have always seen you clearly. You have your grandfather's mind and my stubbornness, both of which will serve you well in life. Your sister is beautiful and charming, but she has a darkness in her that worries me. I've watched her manipulate situations, hurt others without remorse, take what isn't hers simply because she can. Your mother enables this behavior because she finds Rachel easier to understand than you. But easy isn't the same as good. I'm leaving you the business because I know you'll treat it and the people who depend on it with integrity. Rachel would see it only as a source of money and power. Trust yourself, Lauren. You are stronger than you know and more valuable than your family has ever acknowledged. Make me proud. With all my love, Grandmother Elizabeth." Tears were streaming down my face by the time I finished reading. Ethan's hand found mine and squeezed gently. Morrison was watching me with the kind compassion of someone who'd seen too much family pain over too many years. "She knew," I whispered. "She saw who Rachel really was, and she tried to protect me." "She did more than try," Morrison said. "She created a legally binding document that should have been honored. What Rachel did, presenting a forged will, is a serious crime. You have grounds for both civil and criminal action." I looked at the certified will in my hands, at my grandmother's letter, at the evidence of 15 years of theft and betrayal. The business shares alone, if they'd grown at even a modest rate, would be worth millions now. But the money wasn't what made my hands shake and my heart race. It was knowing that someone had believed in me, had tried to give me the tools to build a meaningful life, and that belief had been stolen and buried like it had never existed. Mr. Morrison handed me the certified will and said, "I kept this copy because I knew someday you'd come looking for it. The good ones always do." As I walked out of his house with legal proof of everything I'd lost, I understood that this was no longer about revenge, it was about reclamation. We spent the next week building the trap with the precision of engineers constructing a bridge. Ethan's legal team, Margaret and James, along with 2 other attorneys who specialized in fraud cases, gathered in the conference room every morning to refine the strategy. The certified will gave us leverage, but we needed more than just proof of past crimes. We needed Rachel to incriminate herself in a way that was current, undeniable, and legally actionable. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. I would approach Rachel with a business proposition, playing the role she expected: the slightly pathetic older sister, desperate for connection and validation, eager to finally be part of Rachel's successful world. I'd tell her I'd come into some money, leaving the source deliberately vague so she'd make assumptions, and wanted to invest in one of her real estate development projects. The investment contract would be thick with standard legal language, the kind most people skim over without reading carefully. Buried in that language would be disclosure requirements mandating that all parties reveal any previous instances of fraud, misrepresentation, or financial misconduct. If Rachel signed without disclosing her past actions, she'd be committing fraud in writing with witnesses and documentation. "She won't read it carefully," Margaret predicted, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed the contract for the 5th time. "People like Rachel are too arrogant. She'll assume you're too naive to set a trap, too damaged to fight back. That overconfidence is what will destroy her." James nodded in agreement. "We've seen this pattern dozens of times. The more successful someone is at manipulating others, the more convinced they become that they're untouchable. She's gotten away with so much for so long that it won't even occur to her to be cautious around you." But knowing the trap would work intellectually was different from being prepared to execute it emotionally. I would need to sit across from Rachel, look her in the eyes, and lie as convincingly as she'd been lying to me for decades. I'd need to appear vulnerable while actually being in complete control. I'd need to let her think she was manipulating me while I maneuvered her exactly where I wanted her. Ethan recognized this challenge before I fully articulated it. 2 days after our meeting with Morrison, he brought in a consultant named Dr. Sarah Chen, a former FBI negotiator who now trained corporate executives in high-stakes communication. She was in her 50s with short gray hair and an intensity that made me sit up straighter in my chair. "Ethan tells me you need to maintain a performance under significant emotional pressure," she said, settling into the conference room with a notebook and a recording device. "Let's see what we're working with." For the next 3 days, Dr. Chen put me through scenarios that left me exhausted and emotionally raw. She'd play Rachel hitting every manipulative technique my sister had perfected over the years, the guilt trips, the subtle put-downs disguised as concern, the way of making me question my own perceptions. She'd say things like, "You've always been so sensitive, Lauren, reading into things that aren't there," or, "I just want what's best for you even if you can't see it right now." Each time I reacted with genuine anger or hurt, she'd stop the exercise and we'd analyze what had happened. "Your sister knows how to find your triggers," Dr. Chen explained during one of these debriefs. "She's been studying you your entire life. When she says something designed to hurt you, your face shows pain before you can control it. We need to build new pathways responses that look authentic, but don't actually make you vulnerable." She taught me breathing techniques that calmed my nervous system without being obvious. She showed me how to manufacture micro-expressions that suggested hurt or doubt while keeping my actual emotions locked away. Most importantly, she helped me understand that I didn't need to suppress my anger, I needed to channel it into fuel for the performance rather than letting it control me. "Think of it like this," she said during our final session. "Rachel has been playing a role your entire life, the perfect sister, the innocent victim, the beloved daughter. She's an actress, and she's very good. You're going to be an actress too, but with one crucial difference: you know you're acting. She believes her own performance. That self-awareness is your advantage." By the end of the week, I felt like I'd completed some kind of intensive training program. I was exhausted, but also energized in a way I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about revenge or even justice anymore. It was about reclaiming agency, about refusing to be the passive recipient of other people's cruelty. Still, doubts crept in during quiet moments. Late one evening, I sat in Ethan's office after everyone else had gone home, staring at the contract we'd be using to trap Rachel. "Am I becoming like her?" I asked him. "Setting traps, manipulating situations, deceiving someone even if that someone deserves it?" Ethan looked up from his laptop, his expression thoughtful. "There's a difference between what you're doing and what Rachel does. She destroys innocent people for profit and entertainment. You're creating consequences for someone who's committed actual crimes. Justice sometimes requires strategy, Lauren. That doesn't make you a manipulator, it makes you smart enough not to fight a predator on their own terms without preparation." "What about my mother?" I asked quietly. "When this all comes out, it's going to devastate her. And David, Rachel's husband. He doesn't deserve to have his life destroyed because of who he married." "Your mother chose to participate in hiding the will," Ethan reminded me gently. "She wasn't an innocent bystander. And David is already working to separate his life from Rachel's. He's not as unaware as you think. Sometimes collateral damage happens because people position themselves too close to someone destructive. That's not your responsibility." I wanted to believe him, but I still wrestled with questions of proportionality. How far was too far? At what point did justified consequences become excessive punishment? I thought about the hallway seat at Rachel's wedding, about 10 years of poverty and isolation, about my grandmother's stolen wishes. I thought about the other victims Ethan had identified, people whose lives Rachel had damaged without remorse. Finally, I realized that pulling back now wouldn't be mercy, it would be enabling. Rachel would learn that she could commit fraud, steal inheritances, and destroy careers without facing real consequences. She'd find new victims perfect. Her techniques continue the pattern until someone stopped her. If I had the power to end that cycle and chose not to use it, wouldn't I be partially responsible for whatever she did next? The morning I called Rachel to propose our business partnership. My hand shook as I dialed, not from fear, but from the electric realization that for the first time in my life, I was the one in control of the story. Rachel had responded to my text within minutes, her enthusiasm practically vibrating through the screen. "Lauren, I'd love to discuss an investment opportunity with you. This is so exciting. I've always wanted us to work together. Lunch next week." We'd scheduled it for the following Tuesday, giving me just enough time to refine my performance and settle my nerves. The morning of our lunch meeting, I arrived at Ethan's office early to do a final review of the investment contract. Margaret had the documents spread across the conference table, walking me through each clause one more time to ensure I understood exactly what Rachel would be signing. James was on a call with their forensic accountant, confirming some final details about Rachel's current business structure. That's when the conference room door opened, and David walked in. Rachel's husband, the groom from the wedding where this had all started. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee and wore a business suit that suggested he'd come straight from his own office. He handed one coffee to Ethan with the casual familiarity of someone who'd done it many times before, then turned to see me frozen in my chair staring at him with what must have been complete shock on my face. "Lauren," he said, and had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry. I thought Ethan would have told you I'd be joining this meeting." "Told me what?" My voice came out sharper than I'd intended. I looked at Ethan, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What is Rachel's husband doing here?" David pulled out a chair and sat down, setting his coffee on the table with deliberate care. "I'm not just Rachel's husband. I'm also Ethan's partner in this investigation. I have been for the past 8 months. The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked between the 2 men, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. "You've been working together. You've known about all of this. I married Rachel a year ago." David said, his voice calm and measured, as if he'd prepared this explanation. "I met her at a fundraising gala, and she was everything that seemed perfect: beautiful, charming, interested in my work, supportive of my son from my first marriage. We dated for 6 months before I proposed. I thought I'd found someone special." "What changed?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. About 6 months into the marriage, I noticed irregularities. Money missing from our joint account. Calls she'd take in another room, lowering her voice when I came near. She'd tell me she was meeting friends, but when I casually mentioned it to those friends later, they had no idea what I was talking about. So I hired a private investigator. He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. The investigator's trail led him to Ethan, who'd been documenting Rachel's activities for years. When we compared notes, we realized we were dealing with the same person, just different versions of her manipulation. Ethan spoke up, then his tone apologetic. "David came to me last October. When he told me he'd married Rachel Reed, I knew immediately we needed to work together. He had current access to her life and finances. I had historical documentation of her pattern. Together we could build a case strong enough to stop her permanently." "And the wedding?" I asked, my mind racing back to that humiliating day. "The hallway seat you orchestrated that, didn't you, David? You put me there deliberately so Ethan could approach me." David didn't deny it. "Yes, Rachel wanted you at the wedding for appearances, family unity for the photos. But she also wanted you humiliated, wanted everyone to see your place in the hierarchy." I suggested the hallway seating to her, knowing she'd love the cruelty of it. "And I made sure Ethan knew exactly where you'd be." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. So this whole time, my decision to fight back, my choice to work with Ethan, none of it was actually my choice. You manipulated me into this. "We gave you an opportunity," Ethan said carefully. "That's not the same as manipulation. You could have refused to meet with me after the wedding. You could have walked away after I told you about my past with Rachel. You could have declined to help with the investigation at any point. Every decision you made was your own." But you set the stage, I shot back. You created circumstances designed to push me in a specific direction. How is that different from what Rachel does? David leaned forward, his expression serious. Because we're trying to stop someone who's committed actual crimes. Because we're building a case based on truth, not lies. Because you deserve to know what was done to you, even if the method of revelation wasn't perfect. I have a 4-year-old son, David continued, and I heard real emotion in his voice for the first time. His name is Charlie, and he's the most important thing in my life. When I discovered what Rachel is capable of, the lying, the stealing, the complete lack of empathy, I became terrified of her being around my child. The prenuptial agreement we signed gives her significant financial claims in a divorce unless I can prove fraud or criminal activity. Without solid evidence, she'd get millions of my assets and potentially partial custody of Charlie. I can't let that happen. I studied his face looking for signs of deception, but saw only genuine fear for his child. So you needed me to help build your case. You needed evidence of a pattern extending beyond just what she did to you. Yes, he admitted. But it's not just about my divorce, Lauren. Rachel has victims we probably don't even know about. She's still actively committing fraud through her real estate company. If we don't stop her now with overwhelming evidence, she'll continue. She'll destroy more lives. She'll find new marks. He paused. Your grandmother's will proves she stole your inheritance. The Meridian documentation proves she destroyed your career. My financial records prove she's stealing from me. Ethan's evidence proves she nearly bankrupted his company. Together, these aren't isolated incidents. They're a prosecutable pattern. Margaret, who'd been silent throughout this exchange, spoke up. Lauren, I understand feeling manipulated. But the evidence stands on its own merit, regardless of how you came to be involved in gathering it. Rachel committed crimes. That's not debatable. The only question is whether you want to be part of holding her accountable. I sat there trying to sort through my tangled emotions. Anger at being used. Embarrassment at being naive enough to think my involvement had been entirely my own choice. But underneath those feelings was something else, a grudging recognition that David might be right. If he and Ethan had approached me directly that first night, told me everything they knew, asked me to help them take down my sister, would I have believed them? Or would I have dismissed them as bitter men with axes to grind and warned Rachel that someone was investigating her? I thought about the past few weeks, about how I'd felt working in this office, using my skills again, being treated with respect. I thought about my grandmother's letter, about Morrison's files, about finally understanding why my life had taken the turns it had. Would I trade that knowledge to have been left alone in my small apartment, still believing I'd somehow deserved my fate? David looked me in the eye and said, I know you feel used, but ask yourself this. If I'd told you everything that first night at the wedding, would you have believed me, or would you have run straight to Rachel? He was right. And I hated him for it. After my confrontation with David, I spent 2 days wrestling with my anger before finally accepting an uncomfortable truth. His manipulation had given me something I never would have found on my own. Knowledge, evidence, power. I could either waste energy resenting how I'd gotten here, or I could use what I now had to finish what we'd started. I chose the latter. I texted Rachel 3 days before our scheduled lunch, confirming the time and location. Marcello's, an upscale Italian restaurant in the theater district, where the tables were far enough apart for private conversation. She responded immediately with 3 heart emojis and, "Can't wait." I stared at those hearts for a long moment, wondering if she felt anything real when she typed them, or if even her text messages were performances. The morning of the lunch, I dressed carefully in clothes that walked the line between professional and slightly uncertain, a navy blazer that was good quality, but not designer, modest jewelry, minimal makeup. I needed to look like someone trying to present well, but not quite succeeding, someone who wanted desperately to be taken seriously, but lacked the confidence to pull it off. The recording device Ethan had given me was small enough to fit in my purse, positioned to pick up conversation clearly. James had assured me it was legal in our state to record conversations you were party to, and we'd need the audio to demonstrate Rachel's statements about the investment. I arrived at the restaurant 10 minutes early and waited at the bar sipping water and trying to calm my racing heart. When Rachel walked in, she commanded attention immediately. She wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her hair styled in loose waves, her makeup flawless. She spotted me and waved her smile bright and warm, and for a disorienting moment I saw the little sister I'd once known, or thought I'd known. Then she reached me, and the illusion shattered. "Lauren." She hugged me, and I caught the scent of her expensive perfume. "You look wonderful. I love that blazer." The compliment was calculated to sound sincere, while subtly emphasizing that she'd noticed my outfit was off the rack. I smiled and thanked her, following her to our table, where a waiter immediately appeared to take drink orders. Rachel ordered a bottle of Barolo without looking at the wine list, the kind of casual extravagance that announced she belonged in places like this. Once we were settled with wine poured and appetizers ordered, I launched into my rehearsed script. "So I wanted to talk to you about a business opportunity. I recently came into some money inheritance from a distant relative, and my financial advisor suggested I diversify into real estate. I immediately thought of your company." Rachel's eyes lit up exactly as Ethan had predicted they would. "That's wonderful, Lauren. Real estate is such a smart investment right now, especially with the right guidance. Tell me, how much are we talking about?" "About 50,000. I know it's not a huge amount, but I thought—" No, that's perfect for a starting investment," Rachel interrupted, leaning forward with enthusiasm that looked genuine, but felt predatory. "I have a development project in the works right now that would be ideal for you. It's a mixed-use property near the waterfront retail space on the ground floor, luxury condos above. We're projecting a 30% return over 3 years. She spent the next 20 minutes describing the project in detail using terms she probably assumed would impress me while going over my head. I asked basic questions, let her explain concepts I already understood, played the role of someone out of her depth, but eager to seem knowledgeable. Rachel ate it up, ordering more wine, expanding on her vision, subtly emphasizing how lucky I was that she was willing to include me in such a lucrative opportunity. "The thing about real estate," she said, gesturing with her wine glass, "is that it's really about understanding people. Most people don't have the instinct for it. They get emotional, they second-guess themselves, but some of us just see the angles clearly." She smiled at me with what might have been pity. "That's why I'm happy to guide you through this, Lauren. Family should help family." When the main courses arrived, I pulled out the investment contract that Margaret had prepared. My advisor insisted I get everything in writing. I hope that's okay. It's probably just standard legal stuff, but you know how lawyers are. Rachel waved her hand dismissively. Of course. That's smart, actually. You should protect yourself." The irony of her saying this seemed completely lost on her. I handed her the contract, 32 pages of dense legal language complete with exhibits and addendums. Margaret had buried the critical clauses in Section 14, subsection C, using standard disclosure language that appeared in thousands of investment contracts. Any competent attorney reviewing it would flag those requirements immediately. But Rachel didn't have an attorney with her, and her arrogance wouldn't allow her to admit she might need one. She flipped through the pages quickly, her eyes skimming rather than reading, pausing occasionally to nod as if she understood every word. "This all looks standard. Partnership terms, profit distribution liability clauses. Very thorough." She pulled out a pen from her designer handbag. "Do you have questions about any of it?" "I trust you," I said, and watched her smile widen at my apparent naivete. "You're the expert." She signed on the last page with a flourish, her signature bold and confident, Rachel Ann Reed, written in the flowing script she'd perfected years ago. She didn't notice that her signature appeared under a paragraph requiring all parties to disclose any prior instances of fraud, misrepresentation, or criminal financial activity. She didn't read the clause that made signing without such disclosure an actionable offense in itself. "To new beginnings," Rachel said, raising her glass for a toast. "To sisters finally working together the way we should have all along." I clinked my glass against hers, the crystal ringing with a sound that felt like a death knell. To family, I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. The rest of the lunch passed in a blur of small talk and Rachel's expansive discussion of her various projects and successes. She made several comments that the recording device captured perfectly dismissive remarks about people who don't understand business, assurances that my investment was as safe as family, implications that she was doing me a favor by allowing me into her world. Each statement was another nail in the coffin she didn't know she was building. When we finally parted on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, Rachel hugged me again and whispered, "I'm so glad we're doing this together. I've missed having you in my life." I wondered if she believed that if somewhere in her damaged psychology she'd convinced herself it was true. I walked to my car in the nearby parking garage, my legs somehow carrying me even though I felt disconnected from my body. Once inside, with the doors locked, I allowed myself to shake. My hands trembled so badly I had to try 3 times to start the engine. I'd done it. Rachel had signed the contract, had made the statements we needed, had walked directly into the trap because her overconfidence had blinded her to danger. But instead of triumph, I felt hollow. This was my sister. Somewhere beneath the manipulation and cruelty was the little girl who'd shared a bedroom with me, who'd had nightmares I'd comforted her through, who I'd once loved with the uncomplicated devotion of an older sibling. That girl was either dead or had never really existed, and I was grieving her loss even as I celebrated her downfall. I sat in that parking garage for 10 minutes, letting myself cry for what could have been for the family we might have had if things had been different. Then I dried my eyes, checked my makeup in the rearview mirror, and drove to Ethan's office. I handed Ethan the contract and watched him examine Rachel's signature. Her name written in confident flowing script, completely unaware that she'd just signed her confession, and I thought, this is what hubris looks like in ink. The week after the lunch, Ethan's office transformed into what looked like a war room. Margaret and James worked 16-hour days, joined by 2 additional attorneys and a paralegal who seemed to survive entirely on coffee and adrenaline. The conference table disappeared beneath stacks of documents, each one meticulously organized and cross-referenced. File boxes lined the walls, labeled by year and category: Meridian Financial, 2015 Coal Investments, 2020, Reed Estate, 2010, Current Financial Records, 2025. I watched them build the case with a mixture of awe and growing dread. This wasn't just about proving Rachel had done wrong, it was about demonstrating a pattern so clear and extensive that no one could dismiss it as misunderstanding or bad luck. Margaret walked me through the structure one evening, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she pointed to a timeline she'd constructed on a massive whiteboard. "We have 15 years of documented fraud," she explained, her finger tracing the chronology. "Starting with the falsified will in 2010, moving through your termination at Meridian Ethan's near bankruptcy, and ending with the investment contract she signed last week. But more importantly, we have 4 additional victims who've agreed to provide testimony, people Rachel targeted in smaller ways that individually seemed insignificant, but together show deliberate pattern and intent." James joined us carrying yet another folder. "The investment contract is particularly damning because she signed it knowing or should have known about the disclosure requirements. It's not just that she lied in the past. She's actively committing fraud right now in writing with witnesses. That makes this a current criminal matter, not just historical grievance." "What happens when we present this?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "We're coordinating with the district attorney's office," James said carefully. "Given the scope and dollar amounts involved, they're interested in prosecution. Rachel could face multiple felony counts: fraud, forgery, theft. We're talking about potential prison time, not just civil penalties." The weight of that reality settled over me like a physical thing. Prison. My sister in prison. I'd imagined exposure, humiliation, financial consequences. But somehow the concrete image of Rachel in an orange jumpsuit locked behind bars made everything suddenly real in a way it hadn't been before. "Are you certain?" Margaret asked, watching my face. Once we present this to the DA and hold the press conference, there's no walking it back. Rachel's life as she knows it ends. Her business collapses. Her reputation is destroyed permanently. You need to be absolutely sure." I opened my mouth to answer, but my phone buzzed before I could speak. A text from Rachel. "Hey, sis. Been thinking about our investment. Can we meet tomorrow to discuss some details? Maybe at Mom's house? She'd love to see us working together." It was the third text that day, the seventh that week. Rachel's messages had started casual, thanking me for lunch, asking how I was doing, sharing articles about real estate trends. But over the past few days, the tone had shifted. The questions became more pointed. Had I spoken to anyone about our deal? Who was my financial advisor? Where exactly had the inheritance money come from? The texts grew longer, more insistent, laced with subtle pressure about family loyalty and not involving outsiders in family business. This latest message was the most transparent, yet summoning me to our mother's house using maternal authority as leverage, keeping me where Rachel could monitor and control me. She sensed danger without being able to identify its source, and her instinct was to tighten her grip. "She knows something's wrong," I said, showing Ethan the text. "She can't quite put her finger on it, but she's scared." "Good," Ethan said, though his expression was grim. "Scared people make mistakes. But it also means we need to move quickly. If she starts digging, she might destroy evidence or try to flee." We scheduled the press conference for 2 days later, a Friday afternoon, time to hit the weekend news cycle and give maximum exposure. The district attorney agreed to be present along with a fraud investigator from the state attorney general's office. David would attend to discuss his own victimization and announce his divorce filing. Morrison had agreed to provide a recorded statement about the falsified will. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed watching shadows move across the ceiling, my mind spinning through scenarios of how Friday would unfold. I imagined Rachel's face when she learned the truth. Imagined my mother's reaction, imagined the journalists descending with their cameras and microphones. Part of me wanted to call Rachel to warn her, to give her one final chance to come clean voluntarily and maybe mitigate the damage. Around midnight, I pulled out my laptop and searched for the other victims Margaret had mentioned. I found them through old news articles and social media. A woman whose startup had been sabotaged by a business partner who turned out to be Rachel under an assumed name. A man who'd lost his life savings in a real estate deal where Rachel had been a silent partner. A colleague from Rachel's early career whose reputation had been destroyed by rumors Rachel had planted. Their stories were disturbingly similar to mine, intelligent, successful people who'd been systematically dismantled by someone they'd trusted or underestimated. One victim, a woman named Christine Park, had written a blog post about her experience years after it happened. "The worst part wasn't losing the money," she wrote. "It was realizing that someone had studied me, identified my vulnerabilities, and deliberately exploited them for sport. It wasn't even about profit for her, it was about power. About proving she could destroy someone and get away with it." I closed my laptop and stared at the dark screen, Christine's words echoing in my mind. If I backed out now, if I let Rachel escape consequences again, how many more Christines would there be? How many more people would lose careers, savings, faith in their own judgment, because I'd chosen comfort over justice? At 2 a.m, I called Ethan. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the hour. "Lauren, are you okay?" "I'm ready," I said. "Not for revenge. For accountability. There's a difference." "Yes," he said quietly. "There is. Are you sure?" I thought about the hallway seat, about Morrison's sad eyes when he talked about cases that troubled him, about my grandmother's letter hidden in a necklace for 15 years. Mr. Morrison told me something when we met. He said evil doesn't stop itself, that it requires good people who are willing to fight, even when fighting hurts. He's right. I know. I looked out my window at the city lights, at the same skyline Rachel was probably looking at from her expensive condo, completely unaware of what was coming. This is going to hurt, but I'm ready. We talked for a few more minutes, going over final details, confirming timing. After we hung up, I didn't even try to sleep. I made coffee and watched the sky gradually lighten pink and gold spreading across the horizon like a promise or a warning. As dawn broke over the city, I stood at my window and thought about the last thing Mr. Morrison had said. Evil doesn't stop itself, dear. It requires good people who are willing to fight even when fighting hurts. Today, I would hurt, but Rachel would finally face what she'd done. Friday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Clear skies, moderate traffic, the city going about its business unaware that several lives would be irrevocably changed by evening. I dressed carefully in a charcoal suit that struck the right balance between professional and serious, the kind of outfit that said I was someone to be taken seriously. My hands were steady as I applied makeup steadier than they'd been in days. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. Ethan's PR team released the press statement at 9 o'clock sharp. I watched it go live from my apartment, reading the carefully crafted words on my laptop screen. Cole Investments to announce findings regarding corporate fraud investigation. Victim restitution program to be unveiled. Press conference scheduled for 4 p.m. today at the Riverside Hotel Conference Center. Major financial irregularities spanning multiple years to be disclosed. The statement was a masterpiece of strategic vagueness. It didn't mention Rachel by name, didn't specify the nature of the fraud, but it was compelling enough that business journalists would clear their schedules to attend. Within an hour, Ethan texted me that over 30 media outlets had confirmed attendance, including the major newspapers and 3 television stations. What made the timing particularly elegant or cruel, depending on your perspective, was that Rachel had been promoting her charity gala for weeks. Tonight was supposed to be her triumph, a black tie event at the Museum of Contemporary Art to raise money for children's literacy programs. She'd secured a celebrity host, booked a renowned caterer, invited everyone who mattered in the city's business and social circles. The event was her bid to cement her status as not just a successful developer, but a philanthropist, a pillar of the community. She'd posted about it constantly on social media, each post carefully curated to showcase her generosity and civic commitment. My phone rang at 10:15. Rachel's name appeared on the screen and I let it ring 3 times before answering, making sure my voice sounded sleepy and confused when I finally picked up. "Lauren?" Her voice was tight controlled, but I could hear the panic underneath. "Have you seen the news about some press conference this afternoon?" "What? No, I just woke up. What press conference?" "Cole Investments. Ethan Cole. He's holding some kind of announcement about fraud investigation. Do you know anything about this?" I let a beat of silence pass as if I were processing the information. "That's strange. Why would I know anything about it?" "Because you've been working with him, Lauren. Don't lie to me. I know you've been spending time at his office." "What have you been telling him about me? About our family?" Her mask was slipping. The concerned sister act dissolving into something harder and more desperate. I stuck to the script we'd prepared. "Rachel, I don't understand what you're talking about. I met with Ethan a few times to discuss that investment opportunity you mentioned. That's all. Why would he be investigating fraud?" "I don't know, but the timing is very suspicious. My gala is tonight, Lauren. If this is some kind of..." She stopped herself, and I could practically hear her recalculating. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted back to sisterly concern. "Never mind. I'm sure it's nothing. I'm just stressed about tonight. You're still planning to come, right?" "Of course," I lied smoothly. "I wouldn't miss it." After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone, feeling the weight of that final deception. In a few hours, she'd understand exactly what the press conference was about. She'd know that her sister had been part of dismantling her carefully constructed life. There would be no coming back from this, no possibility of reconciliation or understanding. Whatever relationship we'd had, even the toxic remnant that remained would be permanently severed. At 11 o'clock, David executed his part of the plan. The process server arrived at Rachel's office with divorce papers. I wasn't there to see it, but David called me afterward to describe her reaction. "She went ballistic," he said, his voice carefully neutral. screaming about timing, about how I was trying to ruin her big night, demanding to know what grounds I could possibly have for divorce. I told her to read the paperwork and contact my attorney. The filing freezes all joint assets pending investigation into financial irregularities. How did she respond to that? She laughed. Actually laughed and said I'd never prove anything. Then she threatened to take me for everything I have in the divorce settlement. She still thinks this is about her affair with that contractor. She has no idea we've been building a case for 8 months. After the call ended, I realized I had one more thing to do before the press conference. One final attempt to bridge a gap I knew was unbridgeable. I drove to my mother's house, the split level in the suburbs where I'd grown up, where Rachel and I had shared a bedroom until I left for college. The neighborhood looked exactly the same. Same trees, same houses, same illusion of peaceful normalcy. My mother answered the door wearing a silk robe, her hair in rollers. "Lauren, what are you doing here? I'm getting ready for Rachel's gala tonight." "I know. Can I come in? I need to talk to you about something important." She looked annoyed but stepped aside to let me enter. The house smelled the way it always had. Lavender air freshener and whatever candle my mother was currently burning. I followed her to the kitchen where an expensive cocktail dress was laid out on the table tag, still attached, clearly purchased specifically for tonight's event. I sat down at the kitchen table where I'd eaten thousands of meals, where I'd done homework and had family discussions, and once a lifetime ago felt like I belonged. "Mom, I need to tell you something about Rachel, about things she's done." My mother's expression immediately hardened. "If this is about that ancient business with your job, Lauren, I don't want to hear it. You need to let go of the past. It's not just about my job. It's about grandmother's will. Rachel forged it, Mom. She stole my inheritance and you helped her do it." The words hung in the air between us. My mother's face went through several expressions. Surprise, anger, calculation, before settling on defensive outrage. "That's ridiculous. That's a terrible thing to accuse your sister of, especially on such an important night for her. Honestly, Lauren, this jealousy of yours has gotten out of control." "I have proof. The original will the attorney's testimony bank records showing where the money went. Rachel has been stealing and lying for 15 years, and it's all about to come out. Tonight. There's going to be a press conference and they're going to reveal everything." My mother stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum. "Get out. Get out of my house. I don't know what kind of vendetta you're on, but I won't listen to you destroy your sister because you can't handle her success. Rachel has worked so hard. She destroyed my career, Mom. She stole from Ethan. She's been committing fraud for years, and you've been enabling her because you've never wanted to see the truth about who she really is. Rachel has worked so hard for her success." My mother repeated, her voice rising. "You can't stand seeing her happy. You've always needed to be the center of attention, and when you're not, you make up stories, you cause drama. Just like tonight, trying to ruin her gala with these insane accusations." I looked at the woman who'd given birth to me and realized with crushing finality that there was no reaching her. She'd chosen her version of reality years ago, and no amount of evidence would change her mind. She needed Rachel to be the golden child, because the alternative, accepting that she'd enabled a predator and sacrificed her other daughter, was too painful to contemplate. I stood my legs feeling heavy. "I came here to give you a chance to understand before it all becomes public. But I can see that was a mistake." "Don't you dare do anything to ruin Rachel's night," my mother warned, following me to the door. "Don't you dare make a scene or spread these lies. Family is supposed to support each other, Lauren. When are you going to learn that?" I left my childhood home for what I knew would be the last time, and as I walked to my car, I heard my mother call after me, "Don't do anything you'll regret, Lauren." And I thought, the only thing I regret is waiting this long. I spent the afternoon in my apartment, unable to eat, unable to sit still, checking my phone every 30 seconds, even though I knew the press conference wouldn't start until 4. At 3:30, I gave up on staying home and drove downtown, parking in a lot near the Museum of Contemporary Art, where Rachel's gala was supposed to begin at 6. I found a coffee shop with a window view of the museum entrance and ordered something I didn't drink, then opened my laptop to watch the press conference livestream. At 4 o'clock precisely, Ethan stepped up to a podium in the Riverside Hotel's main conference room. The space was packed. I could see rows of journalists with cameras and recording devices, photographers jockeying for position, even a few faces I recognized from financial news programs. Ethan looked calm and professional in a dark suit, his expression serious but not vindictive. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the speakers. "Today, I'm here to discuss a pattern of financial fraud that has victimized multiple individuals and businesses over the past 15 years. This isn't about a single mistake or misunderstanding. This is about deliberate, calculated criminal behavior that has been allowed to continue because the perpetrator understood how to exploit trust and manipulate systems." He started with theory, discussing how white-collar criminals often operate, gaining access through personal relationships, identifying vulnerabilities, creating paper trails that point away from themselves. He showed statistics about fraud that goes unreported about victims who blame themselves rather than their abusers. The journalists took notes, but I could see some growing impatience waiting for the real story. Then Ethan began presenting case studies. He described a young entrepreneur whose startup was sabotaged by a business partner who stole proprietary information, a man who lost his retirement savings in a real estate deal that turned out to be an elaborate con, an analyst at a prestigious firm who was fired based on falsified evidence of embezzlement. He didn't use names yet, but I recognized each story. These were Rachel's victims, the ones Margaret had found and interviewed. "The common thread," Ethan said, his voice hardening slightly, "is that all of these crimes were committed by the same person. A repeat offender who has exploited legal loopholes and family connections to avoid accountability for over a decade." The screen behind him lit up, and Rachel's face appeared, a professional headshot from her company website, beautiful and smiling and confident. Below it, her name in bold letters, Rachel Reed Morrison, president of Reed Development Corporation. The room erupted. Cameras flashed, journalists shouted questions, but Ethan raised his hand for silence and continued. For the next 20 minutes, he methodically presented the evidence. Copies of the falsified will appeared on screen alongside the original. Bank records showing the flow of stolen inheritance money. The Meridian documents proving Rachel had accessed my accounts. Audio recordings from our lunch meeting where Rachel made dismissive comments about people who don't understand business, and assured me the investment was as safe as family. The investment contract she'd signed without reading, with its disclosure requirements highlighted in red. The most devastating moment came when Ethan played a longer clip from the recording one where Rachel had said something I'd barely registered at the time. "Lauren's always been pathetically eager to finally matter, to finally be part of something successful. It's actually kind of sad." Her voice, so familiar, dripped with contempt that was now broadcast to hundreds of people and being recorded for posterity. I closed my laptop, unable to watch anymore. My hands were shaking and my coffee had gone cold. Across the street, I could see the museum entrance where valets in bow ties stood waiting for guests who should have started arriving by now. The red carpet looked pristine and untouched. My phone buzzed, constantly news alerts, texts from people I hadn't heard from in years, even a few reporters who'd somehow gotten my number. I ignored them all until Ethan's name appeared on the screen. "It's done," he said when I answered. "The DA is moving forward with charges. It's all over the news." "I know. I watched part of it. Lauren, you did the right thing. I know it doesn't feel that way right now, but you did." I thanked him and hung up, then turned my attention back to the museum. At 6:15, I saw the first guests arrive, but they weren't there for the gala. They were journalists, cameras, shouldered microphones ready, descending on the entrance like a swarm. Through the window, I could see figures moving in the lobby, and then Rachel appeared at the door. Even from across the street, even through my imperfect vantage point, I could see she was destroyed. Her hair, which had probably been perfect an hour ago, had come loose. Her makeup was smeared, suggesting she'd been crying. She wore an emerald green evening gown that must have cost thousands, and it made the whole scene even more surreal. This woman dressed for celebration, surrounded by journalists asking about fraud and theft and victims. She said something I couldn't hear from this distance, her mouth moving rapidly, her hands gesturing. The journalists pressed closer. Then Rachel turned and fled back into the building, and security guards moved to block the entrance. My phone rang. My mother's name on the screen. I answered it to shouting incoherent rage about betrayal and lies and how I'd destroyed the family. I hung up after 15 seconds and blocked her number. At 7:30, I watched a few confused guests arrive in formal wear, check their phones, and leave without entering. The catering trucks that had been parked in the loading zone drove away. The valets disappeared. By 8 o'clock, the museum lights were dimming, and I knew Rachel's perfect evening had become a perfect disaster. My phone rang again. Ethan. We have a problem. Rachel left the venue about an hour ago and no one's been able to reach her since. David's at the house, she's not there. Her phone is going straight to voicemail. Something cold slithered down my spine. What are you saying? I'm saying we need to find her. Now. I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning through worst-case scenarios. The press conference had been devastating. Yes, but Rachel was a survivor. She'd talk her way out, hire expensive lawyers, find a way to minimize the damage. She wouldn't do anything desperate. Would she? At midnight, Ethan called again. The police found her car. Where? Parked by the river. Driver's side door open, keys in the ignition. Her phone was on the passenger seat. He paused and I heard him take a shaky breath. Lauren, there was a text typed but not sent. It just said, I'm sorry. The world tilted. I sat down hard on my couch, unable to breathe, unable to think past the terrible possibility that I'd pushed my sister to do something irreversible. All the anger and righteousness that had fueled me for weeks evaporated, replaced by a horror so complete, it felt physical. Then Ethan's voice came through the phone again, but different now, relief mixed with something darker. Wait, we just got something from airport security. There's footage of Rachel at the international terminal 2 hours ago. She's alive, Lauren. She just wants everyone to think she's not. What? She's boarding a flight to the Cayman Islands with a suitcase full of emergency cash. Rachel's attempt at staging her own death lasted exactly 48 hours. David and Ethan had anticipated the possibility of flight and worked with federal authorities to flag her passport. When she tried to clear customs in Grand Cayman using her real identification because she'd panicked and hadn't had time to arrange anything more sophisticated, she was detained immediately. The suitcase she'd been carrying contained nearly $200,000 in cash, withdrawn from various accounts in the hours after the press conference. The authorities treated it as exactly what it was, evidence of flight and consciousness of guilt. The extradition took 3 days of legal wrangling, but by the following Wednesday, Rachel was back on American soil, processed into county jail pending trial. Her bail was set at $2 million, which she couldn't make because David had frozen their joint accounts and her business assets were tied up in bankruptcy proceedings. She spent 2 weeks in jail before her attorney negotiated a plea arrangement. I didn't attend the hearings. I told myself it was because I didn't want to appear vindictive. But the truth was, I couldn't bear to see her in an orange jumpsuit, shackled and diminished. Whatever she'd done, she was still the little girl who'd shared a bedroom with me, and some part of me would always remember holding her hand on the first day of kindergarten. The trial, when it finally happened, was swift and brutal. Rachel's attorneys tried every defense they could manufacture. She had undiagnosed mental health issues, she'd been influenced by bad partners, she'd made mistakes, but not with criminal intent. The prosecution dismantled each argument with methodical precision. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, the pattern too clear. 15 years of deliberate fraud, multiple victims, substantial dollar amounts, sophisticated methods of concealment. This wasn't mental illness or poor judgment. This was calculated predation. Rachel finally accepted a plea deal in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations into her business partners and full restitution to victims. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison for multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. When the judge read the sentence, I was told that Rachel showed no emotion, just stared straight ahead with blank eyes. Her real estate company filed for bankruptcy protection, the same day laying off 37 employees who'd had no knowledge of their employer's criminal activities. The collateral damage extended further than I'd anticipated. My mother, who'd attended every hearing in support of Rachel, had what her doctors called a stress-related medical event the night after sentencing. She spent 3 days in the hospital under observation, and when she was released, she refused to return to the house where she'd raised us. She moved to Arizona to live with her younger sister, my Aunt Patricia, whom I barely knew. Before she left, she wrote me a letter. I found it in my mailbox 2 weeks after Rachel's sentencing, my mother's handwriting on the envelope instantly recognizable. I almost threw it away unopened, but morbid curiosity won out. The letter was 3 pages of vitriol blaming me for destroying the family, for being jealous of Rachel, for lacking compassion and forgiveness. "Rachel made mistakes, but you've destroyed her life," my mother wrote. "You should have been the bigger person. You should have protected your sister instead of conspiring with outsiders to tear her down. I will never forgive you for what you've done to this family." There was no acknowledgement of the crimes Rachel had committed, no recognition of what had been stolen from me. Just anger and blame directed entirely at the daughter who dared to seek justice. I read the letter once and put it in a drawer. I didn't respond. What would I say? That her version of family required me to accept abuse and theft in silence. That being the bigger person had earned me nothing but a decade of poverty and humiliation. That I'd tried to warn her, and she'd called me jealous. There was no point. She'd made her choice long ago, and nothing I could say would change it. David's divorce proceeded without contest. Rachel from prison signed whatever papers her attorney put in front of her. David was awarded full custody of his son Charlie, with Rachel's parental rights suspended pending completion of her sentence and psychological evaluation. The house they'd shared was sold, the proceeds going toward victim restitution and legal fees. David told me in one of our increasingly rare conversations that he was grateful the marriage had been so short. "Charlie barely remembers her," he said. "In a few years she'll just be a story I have to figure out how to tell him." Meanwhile, my own life underwent transformations that should have felt triumphant, but instead felt strange and disorienting. Meridian Financial, desperate to avoid a wrongful termination lawsuit and horrified by the publicity around Rachel's trial, reached out through their attorneys with a settlement offer. They agreed to pay me $800,000 in damages, issue a formal public apology, and provide a letter of recommendation acknowledging my exemplary work during my tenure. The senior partner who'd fired me 10 years ago had retired, and his replacement wanted to clean up the mess he'd inherited. The money from the settlement, combined with my rightful inheritance from my grandmother's estate, which included 15 years of accumulated investment returns and brought the total to over $4 million, meant I was suddenly wealthier than I'd ever imagined being. I could pay off the tiny amount of debt I'd accumulated, buy a real apartment instead of renting a studio, invest for a future that no longer felt precarious. Ethan offered me a permanent position as senior financial analyst at Cole Investments, with a salary that reflected my actual qualifications rather than the diminished resume I'd been living with. I accepted, moved into a proper office with windows, and found myself once again doing the work I'd been trained for, the work I was good at. But none of it felt the way I'd imagined. I'd spent 10 years believing that if I could just clear my name, if I could just get my career back, everything would be fine. I'd thought vindication would taste sweet, that watching Rachel face consequences would bring satisfaction and closure. Instead, I felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. 3 months after Rachel's sentencing, I stood in my new office, tastefully decorated with a view of the city skyline and my name on a placard by the door, and felt nothing but emptiness. I'd won. By any objective measure, I'd achieved everything I'd set out to achieve. Rachel was in prison. My reputation was restored. My financial security was assured. Justice had been served. So why did it feel like I'd lost something essential along the way? I should have felt victorious, standing in my new office with a view of the city. But instead, I felt like a general surveying a battlefield after the war. Yes, we'd won. But at what cost? And could anyone really call this victory? The call from Morrison came on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, 4 months after Rachel's sentencing. I'd been at my desk reviewing quarterly reports when my phone rang, his name appearing on the screen with the unfamiliar area code that told me he was calling from his retirement home rather than his old office. "Lauren, I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, his elderly voice careful and measured. "But something's come up regarding your grandmother's estate that I think you need to know about." The successor firm handling the final closure of the estate had assigned a young attorney named Sarah Chen to review all the financial documents. She'd been thorough, cross-referencing bank statements and transaction records with an attention to detail that older, more jaded lawyers might have skipped. What she found made her bring the file to Morrison, knowing his personal connection to the case. "There are deposits," Morrison explained, and I could hear the reluctance in his voice. "Deposits into your mother's personal account made shortly after your grandmother's will was probated 15 years ago. The amounts and timing are suspicious. Sarah pulled the records, and Lauren, the numbers correspond almost exactly to what you should have received from the estate." I sat very still, my hand gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your mother didn't just enable Rachel. She participated. She profited. Based on these records, it looks like they split your inheritance roughly 30% to your mother, 70% to Rachel." The words hit me like physical blows. I'd spent months coming to terms with Rachel's betrayal, with my mother's willful blindness, and her choice to believe Rachel over me. But this was different. This meant my mother hadn't been fooled or manipulated. She'd been a co-conspirator from the beginning, actively stealing from her own daughter and lying about it for 15 years. Morrison sent me the bank records by secure email. I spent an hour staring at them, watching the pattern emerge with sickening clarity. 3 deposits within 2 weeks of the estate closing, each one structured to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements, totaling just over $900,000. My mother's savings account, which had been modest, suddenly bloomed. She'd used the money to pay off her mortgage, buy a new car, take expensive vacations. She'd been spending my inheritance while watching me struggle in a studio apartment, eating ramen and working a job far beneath my qualifications. I booked a flight to Phoenix that afternoon. My mother was living with my Aunt Patricia in a retirement community, one of those pleasant developments with palm trees and a golf course, and residents who spent their days playing bridge and complaining about their adult children. Patricia answered the door, her expression shifting from surprise to wariness when she saw me. "Lauren, we weren't expecting you." "I need to speak with my mother. Alone." Patricia called into the house, and my mother appeared from the living room wearing a linen pantsuit, her hair freshly styled. She looked older than when I'd last seen her, more fragile, but her eyes were sharp and calculating when they met mine. "What are you doing here?" she asked, not inviting me in. "We need to talk about grandmother's will, and your bank account." Something flickered across her face, fear maybe, or the realization that a secret she'd thought safely buried had been unearthed. Patricia excused herself, sensing this wasn't a conversation she wanted to witness. We sat in Patricia's formal living room, surrounded by tasteful desert landscape paintings and furniture that looked expensive but uncomfortable. I laid the bank records on the coffee table between us. "You weren't just enabling Rachel," I said, my voice steady despite the rage boiling beneath the surface. "You were her partner. You took my inheritance, and you spent it while I lost everything." My mother looked at the records for a long moment, and I watched her make a calculation. She could deny it, manufacture some explanation, play the victim one more time, but something in my expression must have told her I was done with her performances. "Rachel needed help," she said finally, her voice defensive. "She wasn't like you. She didn't have your advantages." What advantages? We grew up in the same house. We had the same parents. The only difference is you decided I was worth less. You were always so smart, so capable, so independent. You didn't need anyone. But Rachel... She stopped, seeming to search for words that would make her actions sound reasonable. Rachel was more fragile. She needed support. She needed money to establish herself. And you would have been fine either way. You're tough. The justification was so absurd, so transparently self-serving that I almost laughed. So you stole my inheritance because I was strong enough to survive being robbed. It wasn't stealing. It was redistribution. Making things more fair. Fair? The word came out sharp enough to make her flinch. You watched me lose my job, my career, my reputation. You watched me struggle for 10 years. And the whole time you were spending the money my grandmother left me, the money she specifically wanted me to have because she knew exactly what kind of person Rachel was. My mother's face hardened. Your grandmother always favored you. She made Rachel feel inferior her entire life. I was trying to correct an injustice. By committing fraud, by forging documents, by stealing from your own daughter. I am your mother, she said, her voice rising. I made a decision about what was best for both my children. Rachel needed that money more than you did, and I needed security in my old age. You were young, you had opportunities. You would have recovered either way. There it was, the truth beneath all the justifications. She hadn't just enabled Rachel's theft. She'd justified taking a share for herself, because she felt entitled to it, because she'd decided her comfort mattered more than my future. I stood no longer able to remain in the same room with her. I could have you prosecuted. The evidence is clear. You conspired to defraud me, and you profited from it. Fear flashed across her face. You wouldn't. I'm your mother. I'm an elderly woman. You're right about one thing. I won't prosecute you. Not because you're my mother, but because the law can't give me what I actually lost. And because you're already living in a prison, isolated, ashamed, having destroyed both your daughters and your own integrity. That's punishment enough. I walked toward the door, but she followed me, her voice taking on a pleading quality I'd never heard before. Lauren, please. We're family. You can't just walk away from family. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, this stranger who'd traded my future for her own comfort. And I said the last words I'd ever speak to her. I don't forgive you. I don't hate you. I nothing you. You're simply no longer part of my life. The look on her face told me she'd finally understood what she'd lost. I flew back from Phoenix that evening and spent the next week in a fog, mechanically going through the motions of work, while my mind processed what I'd learned about my mother. The betrayal by Rachel had been devastating, but at least it made a twisted kind of sense, sibling rivalry taken to sociopathic extremes. But my mother's role felt different, more foundational. She was supposed to be the person who loved me unconditionally, who protected me, who wanted the best for me. Instead, she'd actively participated in destroying my future because she resented my success and felt entitled to my inheritance. Margaret noticed my distraction during a meeting and pulled me aside afterward. You need to do something with this, she said, her tone gentle but firm. All this pain, all this injustice, you can either let it define you or you can transform it into something meaningful. Her words stayed with me. That night I sat in my apartment with a legal pad and started making notes. What if I used part of my inheritance to help others who'd been falsely accused, professionally destroyed, blacklisted without recourse? What if I created the support system I desperately needed 10 years ago but couldn't find? 6 months later, the Reed Foundation opened its doors in a modest office suite downtown. I'd hired 3 full-time employees, an employment lawyer named Marcus, who specialized in wrongful termination cases, a career counselor named Dr. Patricia Hughes, who'd spent 20 years helping displaced executives rebuild, and an office manager named Janet, who kept everything running smoothly. Our mission was straightforward: provide legal support, financial assistance, and career guidance to people who'd been professionally destroyed by false accusations or corporate malfeasance. The application started slowly, then accelerated as word spread. A software engineer fired after a colleague falsified performance reviews to eliminate competition. A teacher whose career ended when a vindictive student made false allegations. A financial analyst blacklisted after discovering embezzlement and being scapegoated by the actual thieves. Each story resonated with my own experience, and helping them felt like finally giving purpose to the decade I'd lost. I threw myself into the foundation work with an intensity that surprised even me. I reviewed applications late into the night, personally interviewed promising cases, sat in on strategy sessions with Marcus about the best legal approaches. For the first time since my 20s, I woke up with a sense of purpose that went beyond survival. I wasn't just living anymore, I was contributing, making a difference, ensuring that others wouldn't suffer alone the way I had. But Margaret had also insisted on something else: therapy. "You can't help others heal if you're still bleeding," she'd said. So I started seeing Dr. Ellen Rothstein, a trauma specialist who worked primarily with victims of family betrayal and long-term psychological abuse. The sessions were harder than I'd anticipated. Dr. Rothstein didn't let me hide behind the narrative of Rachel as villain and me as innocent victim. She pushed me to examine the family dynamics that had existed long before the fraud, the patterns I'd internalized, the ways I'd participated in my own diminishment by constantly seeking approval from people incapable of giving it. "You spent your whole life trying to earn love from your mother and validation from your family," she said during one particularly difficult session. "You believed that if you were just smart enough, successful enough, perfect enough, they'd finally see your worth. But Lauren, they were never going to see it. Not because you weren't worthy, but because they were fundamentally broken." The realization that I'd been seeking something that was never available to give was both liberating and devastating. I'd wasted so much energy, sacrificed so much of myself, chasing approval from people who would never provide it. The hallway seat at Rachel's wedding hadn't been an aberration. It had been a perfect metaphor for where I'd always positioned myself in the family, on the margins, waiting to be invited in, accepting scraps and calling it love. "Real healing, doctor," Rothstein explained, "means accepting that you deserved better, that the problem was never you, and that you have permission to build chosen family instead of clinging to toxic blood relations." The therapy helped, but it didn't solve everything. As the foundation grew and my professional life flourished, my personal life remained stubbornly empty. I'd bought a nice apartment with my inheritance, decorated it carefully, created a space that felt like mine. But I came home to it alone every night. I hadn't dated in years. The Meridian scandal and subsequent focus on justice had consumed all my emotional energy, leaving no room for romance. The few friends I'd maintained from before had slowly drifted away, uncomfortable with the weight of my story, unsure how to relate to someone who'd been through something so dramatic. I attended foundation events, surrounded by grateful clients and supportive donors, gave speeches about resilience and second chances, smiled for photographs with people who called me inspiring. Then I'd drive home alone, park in my assigned spot, ride the elevator to my floor, and unlock the door to an apartment that was beautiful and comfortable and profoundly lonely. Sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd wonder if I'd made the right choice. If I'd just stayed silent, swallowed the injustice, accepted my place in the family hierarchy, I'd still have a mother. I'd have a sister, even if that relationship was toxic. I'd have people to call on holidays, a family to belong to, even if that family was dysfunctional. Instead, I had money and professional success and moral righteousness, and no one to share any of it with. Then I'd remember sitting in that hallway at Rachel's wedding, invisible and humiliated, and I'd know that silence hadn't protected me. It had only taught them I was safe to abuse. Justice had been the right choice, even if it was a lonely one. 6 months after the foundation opened, we held our first major fundraising gala. I stood at the podium addressing a room full of donors, telling them about our mission and our successes, when I saw movement near the back of the ballroom. A man had just entered, checking his coat with an attendant, and when he turned toward the room, I recognized him immediately. Ethan. We'd barely spoken since Rachel's sentencing, both of us needing space to process what we'd been through. But seeing him now in his dark suit with that expression of quiet confidence, I remembered so well. My carefully built composure cracked just enough that I had to excuse myself before anyone noticed I was shaking. I made it through the rest of my speech on autopilot, my voice steady, even as my mind spun with the unexpected sight of Ethan in the ballroom. When I finally stepped down from the podium to polite applause, I excused myself and slipped out a side door into the hotel's courtyard garden, needing air and space to collect myself. The evening was cool, the garden lit by subtle landscape lighting that made the pathway glow softly. I walked to a bench tucked between two flowering bushes and sat down, pressing my palms against the cool stone to ground myself. I'd been doing so well building my new life piece by piece, maintaining the careful emotional equilibrium I'd worked so hard to achieve. Seeing Ethan had knocked something loose inside me opened a door I'd deliberately kept closed. "Lauren." His voice came from behind me, quiet and careful. I turned to see him standing at the edge of the pathway, hands in his pockets, looking uncertain in a way I'd never seen before. During our work together, he'd always been confident, controlled, strategic. Now he looked almost vulnerable. "I'm sorry for showing up unannounced," he said, moving closer but stopping a respectful distance away. "I debated whether to come tonight, but I wanted to see what you'd built with the foundation. It's remarkable, Lauren. Truly." "Thank you." My voice came out smaller than I'd intended. "Why didn't you let me know you were coming?" "Because I wasn't sure you'd want to see me. We haven't talked much since the trial ended." He sat down on the bench, leaving space between us. "I think we both needed distance to process everything that happened, but I've been thinking about you. About us, actually." The word us hung in the air, loaded with implications I wasn't prepared to examine. "What do you mean?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Working with you changed me. Watching you navigate impossible circumstances with grace and strength, seeing you transform pain into purpose, it made me realize that what started as a shared mission became something more, at least for me. I'd like to have dinner with you. Not as colleagues, not as co-conspirators in justice, but as two people getting to know each other outside the context of revenge and legal battles." I stared at him, my mind racing. In all the months we'd worked together, I'd never allowed myself to think of Ethan romantically. He'd been a tool for justice, an ally in war, a partner in the systematic dismantling of Rachel's life. The idea of seeing him as an actual person, someone I might have feelings for, felt disorienting and dangerous. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "You could start with whether the idea is completely repellent to you or just terrifying." Despite everything, I almost laughed. "Terrifying. Definitely terrifying." "That's something, at least." He shifted slightly, his expression serious. "Lauren, I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now. I'm just asking if you'd be willing to explore the possibility of getting to know each other as people, not just as people united by trauma and rage." The honesty in his voice made something in my chest ache. I was attracted to him, of course I was. He was intelligent, principled, understood what I'd been through in a way no one else could. But that understanding was also what terrified me. What if my attraction was just trauma bonding? What if I was drawn to him because he was the first person in a decade who'd seen my pain and validated it? What if I was confusing gratitude with genuine connection? "I need time," I said finally. "I'm still figuring out who I am outside of survival mode. I spent 10 years just trying to get through each day, and then the last year focused entirely on justice. I don't know how to be a person who goes on dates and thinks about romance. I don't even know if I'm capable of trusting someone that way anymore." Ethan nodded, and I saw something like relief in his expression. "I understand. And Lauren, there's no pressure. I'll wait as long as you need. I just wanted you to know that I'm interested, and when you're ready, if you're ready, I'd like to explore what this could be." The fact that he was willing to wait, that he understood why I'd need time, somehow made me want to say yes even more. But I also knew that making decisions from a place of loneliness or gratitude would be a mistake. We talked for a few more minutes about neutral things, the foundation his work, the strange, surreal quality of life after the storm. Then he excused himself, saying he didn't want to take more of my time on what should be my celebration night. As he walked away, I felt an odd mixture of regret and relief. The following week, David called and asked to meet for coffee. We'd stayed in loose contact since his divorce from Rachel finalized occasional texts checking in on each other's well-being, the connection of two people who'd survived the same war. We met at a cafe near his office, and after the initial pleasantries, David got to the point with characteristic directness. "Ethan told me he asked you to dinner." "He did." "How much did he tell you?" "Enough to know he's serious about this, and enough to make me want to give you some context." David stirred his coffee, choosing his words carefully. "Ethan's a good man, Lauren. One of the best I know. But he's also been in therapy for the past 2 years, dealing with his own issues around trust and relationship patterns. After what Rachel did to him, he's had to do a lot of work on why he was attracted to someone that manipulative in the first place." I felt my stomach tighten. "Are you telling me he has a pattern of choosing damaged women?" "No, I'm telling you he has a pattern of choosing unavailable partners, people who are so focused on other things that real intimacy becomes impossible. His therapist thinks it's a defense mechanism, a way of protecting himself from getting hurt again." David met my eyes directly. "You're not damaged, Lauren, but you are still healing. And I want to make sure both of you are making decisions from a healthy place, not from loneliness or trauma bonding." The honesty was both appreciated and painful. "So you're saying we shouldn't pursue this?" "I'm saying take your time. Be cautious. My marriage to Rachel failed partly because I ignored red flags desperate for connection after my first divorce. I projected onto her what I wanted to see instead of seeing who she actually was. Don't make decisions from desperation or loneliness. Make them from clarity." That night, Ethan texted me a simple question. "Coffee tomorrow. No pressure, just coffee." I stared at my phone for an hour, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, trying to decide if I was brave enough to risk my heart after everything else I'd already risked. I eventually replied to Ethan's text with a simple, "Yes." And we met for coffee the following Saturday. It was awkward and tentative, two people who'd only ever known each other in crisis trying to figure out how to have a normal conversation. But there were moments of genuine connection, glimpses of possibility that made me think maybe eventually I could open myself to this. We agreed to take things slowly, to keep seeing each other casually with no expectations or pressure. It felt manageable, safe even. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived in my mailbox with the return address of the state correctional facility where Rachel was serving her sentence. The envelope was standard prison issue, thin and slightly rough, with my name and address written in handwriting I'd known my entire life. Rachel's elegant script looked strange on the cheap paper, like seeing a ball gown in a thrift store. I left the letter unopened on my kitchen counter for 3 days, walking past it multiple times each morning and evening, unable to decide whether to read it or throw it away. Finally, on a quiet Sunday morning, I made coffee, sat down at my table, and opened it. The letter was 4 pages long, written in blue pen on lined paper. Rachel's handwriting was still beautiful, but I could see where the pen had pressed harder in places where she'd paused, and then continued the physical evidence of difficulty in what she was trying to say. "Dear Lauren," it began, "I don't expect you to read this, and I definitely don't expect you to respond. But my therapist here says that accountability means facing what I've done, and part of that is being honest with the people I've hurt. So here's my honesty for whatever it's worth. I spent my entire childhood hating you. Not because you did anything to me, but because everyone preferred you. Teachers called on you first. Grandparents asked about your achievements. Even Mom and Dad, though they tried to hide it, were more impressed by your intelligence than by anything I did. I was the pretty one, the charming one, but you were the one with substance. And I couldn't stand it." The letter continued in this vein, Rachel dissecting her own psychology with a clarity I'd never heard from her before. She wrote about building her identity around being better than me, about the satisfaction she felt each time she managed to take something that was mine. She admitted that destroying my career at Meridian hadn't been about money or opportunity. It had been about proving she could do it, about feeling powerful for once. "You were everything I wanted to be," she wrote near the end, "and I hated you for it. Now I'm everything you could have become if you'd let bitterness win, and I understand why you didn't. You were always stronger than me. I just wish I'd figured that out before I destroyed both our lives." The letter didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't make excuses or claim she'd been mentally ill or traumatized. It was simply an accounting, a statement of what had happened and why offered without any expectation of absolution. I brought the letter to my next therapy session, and Dr. Rothstein read it carefully before looking up at me. "How does this make you feel?" "I don't know. Sad, mostly, and confused about whether I should visit her." "What would you hope to gain from a visit?" "Closure, I guess. Or maybe just to see her as a real person one final time, not as the villain in my story." Dr. Rothstein set down the letter. "There's no right answer here, Lauren. Visiting Rachel might give you peace, or it might stir up emotions you've worked hard to process. Only you can decide if the potential benefit is worth the risk." I thought about it for 2 weeks, weighing the competing desires for closure against the fear of reopening wounds. Finally, I decided to go, but on strict terms: 1 visit, no promises of future contact, no expectation of reconciliation. I arranged it through the prison's visitor system and drove to the facility on a gray Tuesday morning, my hands trembling on the steering wheel the entire way. The prison was exactly as grim as I'd imagined: concrete and chain-link fence and guard towers, a monument to human failure and consequences. I went through security, surrendering my belongings, being scanned, and searched the whole process designed to strip away dignity and autonomy. Finally, I was led to a visiting room with small tables bolted to the floor, each with 2 chairs facing each other. Rachel entered from a side door, escorted by a guard, and I barely recognized her. The woman who'd stood in that emerald gown at her failed gala, who'd always been perfectly coiffed and made up, was gone. Prison. Rachel had gray roots showing in her hair, no makeup, a jumpsuit that hung on a frame that had lost weight. She looked older than her 36 years, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. We sat down across from each other, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. I studied her face, looking for traces of the little girl I'd once loved, the sister who'd existed before jealousy twisted her into something monstrous. She was in there somewhere beneath the damage and the years of bad choices. "Thank you for coming," Rachel said finally, her voice quiet. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either." "Did you get my letter?" "Yes, I read it." Rachel nodded, her hands folded on the table between us. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I'm glad you won. Someone had to stop me, and I'm grateful it was you instead of someone who would have destroyed me completely. You could have, you know. You had every right to push for maximum sentencing to make sure I never got out. But you didn't." I looked at her directly, needing her to understand something fundamental. "I didn't do this for you. I did it for me, and for the people you hurt. What happens to you now, whether you change, whether you heal, whether you become a better person, that's your responsibility, not mine. I'm not your savior or your judge. I'm just done being your victim." "I know." She smiled slightly, a sad expression that held no manipulation, no hidden agenda. "You were always the strong one, Lauren. I just couldn't see it because I was too busy being jealous." We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing important: the foundation, her prison therapy sessions, neutral topics that skirted around the deeper pain. As I stood to leave, Rachel said something that caught me off guard. "You'll be a good mother someday. You'll know what not to do." It was the closest thing to a blessing I'd ever received from her, an acknowledgement that I'd escaped the cycle that had trapped her. I nodded, unable to form words past the unexpected lump in my throat, and walked out. Walking out of that prison, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of release, as if a tether I didn't even know I was carrying had finally been cut, and I was floating free in open sky for the first time in my life. The prison visit had done something unexpected. It had freed me to move forward without the weight of unfinished business. 2 days later, I texted Ethan and suggested we try that coffee date again, but this time without the heavy conversation about trust and timing. Just coffee, just two people getting to know each other. We met on a Saturday morning at a cafe neither of us had been to before neutral territory. The first 20 minutes were stilted, both of us hyper-aware that we were trying to be different versions of ourselves than the war partners we'd been. But then Ethan told a story about his niece's disastrous school play, and I laughed, really laughed for the first time in months. Something shifted after that. We stopped trying so hard and just talked. He told me about growing up in Boston, about his sister who taught high school English and sent him terrible poetry her students wrote. He confessed his embarrassing love for action movies, the more explosions the better, and admitted his previous marriage had ended not because of betrayal, but because they'd grown in different directions and had the maturity to recognize it. I found myself telling him about my abandoned passion for photography, how I used to spend weekends capturing the city from different angles until the Meridian scandal made me sell my camera equipment to pay rent. Coffee turned into lunch, which turned into a walk through the botanical gardens, which somehow became dinner at a small Italian restaurant where we talked about everything and nothing until the staff started stacking chairs around us. 12 hours passed like minutes, and I realized with surprise that I hadn't thought about Rachel or justice or revenge even once. I'd just been present, enjoying conversation with someone who made me laugh and think and feel like a person instead of a collection of wounds. We started dating after that, but carefully. We established rules that felt more like safety nets. We'd both continue individual therapy, maintain our separate friend groups and interests, check in regularly about how things felt. I was vigilant about not losing myself in the relationship, about maintaining the identity I'd worked so hard to build. Ethan not only respected this, but insisted on the same boundaries for himself. We had our first real fight about something wonderfully mundane, his chronic lateness versus my need for punctuality, and instead of it destroying us, we talked it through like adults and found compromise. 3 months in, Ethan invited me to his sister's house for Sunday dinner. I met his family, his sister Sarah and her husband, their 2 teenagers, his elderly father who told terrible jokes and was overwhelmed by how easy it all was. They teased each other with affection, asked genuine questions about my work, included me in their running jokes without making me feel like an outsider. It was so different from the family dinners of my childhood where every word was weighted with judgment and competition. In the car afterward, I started crying, unable to articulate why. Ethan pulled over and held me while I sobbed for the family I'd never had, for the ease and warmth I'd thought only existed in other people's lives. "You can have this now," he said quietly. "You can build the family you deserved." Meanwhile, the foundation continued to grow beyond anything I'd imagined. We helped over 200 people in our first year, winning cases, securing settlements, helping rebuild careers that had been destroyed by false accusations or corporate malfeasance. The media noticed, and suddenly I was being invited to speak at conferences, to give interviews, to share my story on platforms that reached thousands of people. A publisher approached me about writing a book. I was hesitant at first, afraid of becoming defined by my trauma, but my agent convinced me it could be more than that. A guide for others navigating similar betrayals, a roadmap for institutional reform. I started writing in the early mornings before work, finding unexpected healing in putting the story into words. A year after Rachel's trial, I stood on a stage at a national conference on workplace justice, addressing 500 people about the Foundation's work and the systemic changes we needed to protect whistleblowers and fraud victims. Mid-speech, I realized something that made me pause. I wasn't telling a story about what was done to me anymore. I was telling a story about what I'd done with what remained, and that subtle shift changed everything. For the Foundation's 2nd annual gala, I made a deliberate choice that surprised everyone on my team. I booked the Grandview Hotel, the same venue where Rachel's wedding had taken place 2 years earlier, the site where I'd sat in a hallway on a folding chair while my family celebrated without me. Janet, my office manager, had looked at me with concern when I announced the decision. "Are you sure, Lauren, won't that be difficult?" But I knew exactly what I was doing. I needed to return to that place, not as a victim, but as the woman I'd become. The night of the gala, I arrived early and walked through the hotel alone before guests arrived. The lobby looked exactly the same: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, the scent of expensive flowers. I made my way to the ballroom, now decorated with the foundation's colors and banners, then continued down the hallway where I'd been exiled. The folding chair was gone, of course, replaced by a tasteful console table with a flower arrangement. I stood in that spot for a long moment, letting myself remember the shame and hurt and humiliation I'd felt sitting there. Then I consciously released it, feeling the memory lose its power over me. I'd been broken in this place, but I hadn't stayed broken. When guests began arriving an hour later, I stood at the ballroom entrance, greeting them wearing a midnight blue gown that made me feel powerful and beautiful. People I'd helped through the foundation embraced me with tears in their eyes. Major donors shook my hand and told me they believed in the work. I was the center of attention, but this time on my own terms, celebrated for what I'd built rather than tolerated as an inconvenience. I spotted Mr. Morrison across the room, 84 now, and leaning on a cane, his wife supporting his other arm. He waved when he saw me, his face creasing into a proud smile. Several former colleagues from Meridian were there too, people who'd worked alongside me before the scandal. A few approached to apologize for not speaking up years ago, for believing the accusations, for letting fear of association keep them silent. I accepted their apologies with grace, understanding that courage is often found in hindsight. The most surprising arrival was David walking in with a small boy whose hand he held carefully. Charlie was 7 now, bright-eyed and curious, wearing a suit that was slightly too big for him. David guided him over to me, and Charlie presented a handmade card with careful printing. "Thank you for helping my dad. You are brave." I knelt down to his level, thanking him for the card, feeling my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. David pulled me aside as Charlie went to inspect the dessert table. "Rachel wrote to me last month," he said quietly. "She asked if I'd bring Charlie to one of your events. She said she wants him to understand that you're who he should grow up to be like, not her. I thought you should know." Later in the evening, after dinner and the program of speakers, Ethan took the microphone. I assumed he was going to thank donors, but instead he began talking about the first time we met. Lauren Reed was sitting in a hallway, treated as invisible by people who should have valued her most. But even then, she carried herself with a dignity that impressed me immediately. She taught me that strength isn't about never being broken, it's about what you build from the pieces. Then he gestured off stage, and 2 staff members brought out a beautiful upholstered chair with carved wooden arms and a small brass plaque on the back. "Reserved for Lauren Reed, founder." My hand flew to my mouth as tears blurred my vision. "This chair will sit in the foundation lobby," Ethan explained to the room, "as a reminder that where you start doesn't determine where you end, that the people who tried to make you invisible were wrong, that you can reclaim your story and write it in your own words." The room erupted in applause as I stood overwhelmed and grateful, and more moved than I could articulate. Ethan caught my eye across the crowd and smiled that quiet, confident smile I'd grown to love. After the gala ended and guests filtered out, I asked the hotel staff if I could have a moment alone. I walked back to that hallway and sat in my custom chair right in the center of the space where I'd once been hidden away. And I realized that reclaiming your story isn't about erasing the painful chapters. It's about writing new ones so beautiful they transform the meaning of what came before. 5 years passed, like water flowing downhill, sometimes rushing, sometimes still, but always moving forward. The Reed Foundation grew beyond anything I'd imagined that first uncertain year, helping over 2,000 people reclaim careers and reputations that had been stolen through false accusations or corporate betrayal. My book, Reclamation: Building a Life After Betrayal, became a bestseller not because people wanted a revenge story, but because they recognized themselves in the struggle to rebuild from ruins. I bought a house in a neighborhood with tree-lined streets, the first home I'd ever owned, and spent weekends in the garden growing tomatoes and roses and herbs that made the whole backyard smell like possibility. Ethan and I married 2 years after that gala in a small ceremony with 20 people who actually knew and loved us. No family drama, no performances, just honest joy. Now at 43, I was 6 months pregnant with a daughter we'd already named Claire. Sometimes I'd rest my hand on my growing belly and think about Rachel's words in that prison visiting room. "You'll be a good mother someday. You'll know what not to do." I was determined to break every cycle to give this child the unconditional love and authentic connection I'd spent my whole life searching for. Rachel was released after serving 3.5 years with good behavior. I learned about it not from her but from a brief news article I stumbled across online. She didn't contact me immediately, which I appreciated. 6 months later, a card arrived in my mailbox, simple, no return address except a P.O. box number. "Lauren, I'm out. I'm working and doing the work. I hope you've found peace. R." I set the card aside and didn't respond for weeks, learning that not every overture required an immediate answer, that silence could be its own form of honesty. But curiosity eventually won. I agreed to meet her one Sunday morning at a coffee shop. Neither of us had history with neutral ground for a conversation I wasn't sure either of us needed. Rachel arrived looking like a stranger, her hair unstyled and showing natural gray at the roots, wearing jeans and a plain sweater, no jewelry except a simple watch. She'd lost the polished armor that had always defined her, and what remained was just a tired woman trying to rebuild a life from nothing. We ordered coffee and sat across from each other, testing boundaries with careful small talk. She told me about her 2 jobs, reception at a dental office and weekend shifts at a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated women. She lived in a studio apartment and took the bus. She wasn't asking for sympathy, just stating facts. When she asked about my life, I shared selectively the foundation's growth, my marriage to Ethan, the book I'd written. I didn't mention the pregnancy. Some joys were still too precious to risk exposing to old wounds. "I read your book," Rachel said as we prepared to leave. "The part where you wrote that forgiveness is optional but freedom is essential, that line stopped me cold. I'd been waiting for you to forgive me like that was the key to my redemption. But you were right. I had to forgive myself and do the work whether you ever forgave me or not." We didn't hug, we didn't exchange numbers or make promises about staying in touch. But we parted with a mutual understanding that we were both doing the difficult work of becoming better than we'd been. That evening, I sat in my garden watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber, and rose my hand resting on the swell where my daughter grew. Through the kitchen window, I could hear Ethan singing off-key to the radio while he cooked dinner, and the sound made me smile. I thought about the hallway seat, about Morrison's kind eyes, about my grandmother's letter hidden in a necklace. I thought about justice and accountability, and the long road from humiliation to peace. The story I thought I was living, a revenge narrative, had actually been something different all along. I hadn't gotten revenge on Rachel. I'd gotten myself back. The best parts of who I'd been before the scandal, combined with the strength forged through years of struggle, plus the wisdom that came from choosing justice over bitterness. As Ethan called me inside, I whispered to my daughter, "You'll never have to sit in the hallway, little one. You'll always have a place at the table." I stood, brushed the garden dirt from my hands, and walked toward the warm light spilling from my kitchen door. Peace, I'd learned, wasn't about getting everything you lost back. It was about building something so fulfilling that what you lost no longer defined you. And in that garden, with the sunset fading and my real family waiting inside, I finally understood what it meant to be home. Conclusion. 500 words. And that's where Lauren's story ends, or perhaps where it truly begins. 5 years after sitting in that hallway, invisible and humiliated, she'd built a life that didn't just recover what was stolen, but created something entirely new. A foundation that helps thousands. A marriage built on honesty and mutual respect. A child on the way who would grow up knowing unconditional love. And most importantly, peace with herself and the choices she'd made. Lauren's journey teaches us something profound about Justice's family and the courage it takes to stand up for yourself when everyone else tells you to stay silent. She could have accepted that hallway seat as her permanent place in the family. She could have convinced herself that keeping the peace was more important than seeking the truth. She could have let Rachel continue hurting people, let her mother continue profiting from theft, let the lies stand unchallenged. But she didn't. And that choice, as painful and costly as it was, ultimately set her free. What strikes me most about this story is that Lauren didn't become bitter. She didn't let revenge consume her or turn her into someone as cruel as Rachel. Instead, she channeled her pain into purpose, her anger into action, and her trauma into a mission to help others. That's the difference between revenge and justice, between destruction and reclamation. Lauren didn't destroy Rachel to feel powerful. She exposed the truth so that no one else would suffer the same fate. And Rachel? Even she found a path forward, however difficult and uncertain. Prison didn't erase what she'd done, but it gave her the space to finally confront who she'd become. Her journey reminds us that people can change, even if that change doesn't erase the consequences of their actions. Some relationships can't be repaired, and that's okay. Sometimes the healthiest thing is to acknowledge the damage, learn from it, and move forward separately. So I want to ask you, have you ever been in Lauren's position? Have you ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to love you? Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and seeking justice? How did you handle it? What would you have done differently? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story resonated with you, if Lauren's journey from that hallway seat to a place of peace and purpose moved you or made you think differently about justice and forgiveness, please hit that subscribe button. We share stories like this every week, real human experiences about betrayal, resilience, family dysfunction, and the courage it takes to rebuild your life when everything falls apart. These aren't just stories for entertainment. They're reminders that you're not alone, that others have faced similar darkness and found their way to light, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to accept the role others have assigned you. Thank you for listening to Lauren's story. Thank you for being here. And remember, you always have a place at the table, even if you have to build that table yourself.